It's time to sing a song for the unsung heroes. Let's all stand up tall and sing it loud. Let's all sing a song for the unsung heroes. And when we're through, there will be no doubt. Sing it for the ones that didn't make it, and sing it for the ones who live to tell. Sing it for the doctors and the nurses and the corpsmen who witnessed living hell. We'll sing it for the ones who flew the choppers. Sing it for the ones who flew the jets. Let's make sure that we all remember, 'cause the price they pay is too much to forget. So let's all sing a song for the unsung heroes. Let's all stand up tall and sing it loud. Let's all sing a song for the unsung heroes. And when we're through, there will be no doubt. Let's all sing a song for the unsung heroes. Let's all stand up tall and sing it loud. Let's all sing a song for the unsung heroes. And when we're through, there will be no doubt. And when we're through, there will be no doubt. Let's all sing a song for the unsung heroes. Let's all stand up tall and sing it loud. Let's all sing a song for the unsung heroes. Let's all stand up tall and sing it loud. Let's all sing a song for the unsung heroes. Let's all stand up tall and sing it loud.
VVMF's In Memory program honors those who served in Vietnam, returned home, and later died. Every year, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund hosts a special ceremony overlooking the wall in Washington, D.C. When we induct new honorees into the In Memory Honor Roll, one special thing we usually do during In Memory Weekend is a reading of the names of all past honorees. As the ceremony continues to grow, and as we honor more and more Vietnam veterans, we make changes to improve this program each year. In the past, we've done this reading in different ways on site, but we received such wonderful feedback about having a virtual reading for the first time 2 years ago, we will continue this tradition. Doing the reading virtually allows more of you to hear your loved ones' names being read each year, and allows you to share this with friends and families near and far. We'll read the names of all past honorees, those honored from 1993 to 2023, alphabetically by year of acceptance into the program. This reading will not include the 2024 honorees, as the reading of their names will be done by friends and family at the ceremony tomorrow. We ask your forgiveness for any mispronounced names. Know that we're doing our best to honor and remember your loved ones.
Leonard Baudry, David Blassingame, Larry Butts, Harlan Butts, James Buck, Nicholas Codd, John Coder, Donald Dunn, Russell Elderbaum, Edward Evans, Anthony Fasiglia, Jack Fontenot, Dennis Geary, Richard Gobble, Andrew Govito, Gary Gray, Roger Greer, Charles Giff, Patrick Gwynn, John Henson, Donald Howland, Harvey Jett, Harold Kelly, Charles Kent, Gerald Lefebvre, Donald McDowell, William Nicholson, Stephen Olson, Leonard Polikov, Terence Reynolds, Daniel Stork, Herman Vollmer, Nils Anderson, Jesse Beza, Wilbur Ballard, John Beardsley, Ronald Bogart, Arthur Bovin, Robert Chastik, Paul Clausen, Thomas Code, Charles Copeland, Michael Corcoran, Richard Curcio, Richard Eckart, Dennis I, Carl Fields, Frank Forty, Bruce Fosberg, Keith Freeberger, Philip Geitz, Frank Gonzalez, Harlan Grable, Stephen Grime, Noel Hall, Henry Haggerty, James Hill, Eddie Holder, Alvis Holtmeyer, Robert Jackson, Anthony Janusik, Robert Johnson, Robert Kerr, Louis Mara,
Marlon Matheny, Jimmy Miller, Burton Mowers, James Murphy, Robert Nelson, Douglas Pickle, Louis Puler, John Reed, Lauren Roberts, James Rogers, George Shannon, Edward Sheldon, Robert Steele, Ronald Thompson, Raymond Van Ness, Harry White, Earl Young, Larry Abbott, Edwin Azure, Thomas Alexander, Glenn Alexander, James Alloway, Gus Anestis, John Anusvitz, Kenneth Atkinson, Douglas Babcock, Wayne Bachtel, Dale Bailey, Gerald Baker, Warren Barnes, Gabriel Bathory, Donald Bell, Stephen Belleville, James Bennett, Russell Benton, Wayne Bergquist, Ronald Bernhardy, Kenneth Binash, Kenneth Blair, John Boehringer, John Bolus, Terry Bowles, Dale Braden, Paul Brady, Russell Brannon, Dennis Brask, John Bresla, William Breon, Robert Britt,
Francis Brooks, Fred Brooks, Clifford Brown, Earl Bryant, Kenneth Buck, Dennis Buckaloo, Gary Campbell, Michael Carolon, Estelle Caudill, Adolphe Seha, James Chapman, Emile Carbonnet, Robert Chase, Robert Sharon, Suzanne Cisco, Paquel Chuka, Ray Clark, Edward Collingsworth, Travis Connolly, Joel Cook, Eugene Corbett, Elias Cordova, David Coville, James Cox, Glenn Grandel, William Cullen, Charles Curtis, Thomas Cusick, Russell Dalton, Alan Davenport, Charles Davis, Christopher de la Fleur, William DeMille, Richard Deneen, Harold Denny, Dennis Dickerson, Gary Deal, Gerald Dominski, Steve Dungus, David Dodson, Johnny Downey, Francis Duffy, Harold Durant, Daniel Elston, William Erbe, Donnie Erickson, Edward Erkinger, and John Faiola, Robert Ferguson, Samuel Fetchel, Don Finn, James Franks, Franklin Freshour, Dale Geyer, Francis Gould, Kevin Gouvin, James Gray, Leonard Gunau, James Haas, Michael Hock, Donald Hark, Fred Harned, Gary Hasselbeck, Wilfred Hasselted,
Larry Hatcher, Roy Hayes, William Hetty, Paul Henson, Ruben Hernandez, William Hewitt, Raymond Hicks, Robert Hill, Harry Hurst, Edmund Hoban, Douglas Hofel, Ralphie Hoffman, Earl Hofstede, Robert Hollis, Steve Horowitz, Louis Hoskins, Ben Howard, Dennis Hunter, Keith Hutzel, Daniel Iliff, Daryl Jensen, Ned Johnson, Melvin Johnson, James Johnston, Garland Jolly, Merle Kane, Thomas Keeg, Robert Kennedy, Carl Kerr, Michael Kissinger, Paul Kidder, Richard Kilbourne, Paul Killian, Daryl Kilzer, Raymond King, William King, Donald Kingrey, Gregory Klein, John Klimek, Bernard Kliss, John Kowalczyk, Dennis Kramer, Rex Lacey, John Landensack, Kenneth Lamphere, Michael Landsman, David Lorette, Richard Larson, John Laser, Simone Lazara, Frank Lee, William Lenander, Horace Levy, Gary Lestrani, Lance Lockhart, Alvin Long, Larry Longwell, David Ledwig, John Larson, James McCulley, Donald Messiah, Jack Madison, John Maloney, Michael Martirosian,
Sidney Marks, Charles Massey, David Malden, Jerry McCord, David McElhaney, Gary McFarlane, Daniel McGinley, James McPoyle, Raymond Mello, Nicholas Messia, Ralph Metcalf, Langford Metzger, James Miller, Ramon Mills, Joseph Miser, William Mitchell, David Mix, Robert Montgomery, Ross Morey, Herbert Moseley, John Muir, Justin Mulnick, Alan Murphy, Francis Murphy, Robert Murphy, Hallard Myers, George Nayu, Todd Needles, Edward Norman, Lori O'Neill, Stephen O'Reilly, John Oliver, Robert Uten, James Ott, Michael Otto, James Otto, Robert Overacre, Robert Oxley, Dennis Palmer, Kagi Parnell, Albert Patton, Ricky Peterson, Gerald Picard, Robert Pierce, Clifford Pitts, James Porter, James Price, Ronnie Price, Eddie Perky, Mike Quirk, Michael Radich, Emil Radix, Stephen Ray, Perry Randall, Ricky Ray, Robert Reed, Vincent Rebocus, Robert Reher, Terry Remitz, Odie Richardson, William Rippeth, James Rivard, William Roach, Donald Robertson,
Michael Rogers, John Rolls, Conrad Rondo, Eugene Rooney, Dennis Roxbury, Michael Russick, Clarence Rust, Michael Sanford, David Sheffers, Raymond Schmid, Craig Scott, Peter Scursatone, Leon Sangstock, Charles Cernett, Vernon Sherv, Daryl Shockley, Harry Shoup, James Sugart, James Sides, Robert Simon, Ernest Simpson, Roger Smedgel, David Smith, Robert Smith, John Snyder, Rajput Sukhdev Singh, James Sousa, Jerome Spieth, Randy Spurlock, Robert Stogdale, John Stowe, Terry Strasco. Marshall Swain, Roy Swanson, Victor Tanner, John Taylor, David Taylor, William Thomas, Brian Tamanis, Wiley Tripp, Donald Toomey, James Turnbull, Bert Twiggs, Vincent Ursula, Anthony Velez, Ronald Vogt, Alvin Walker, Timothy Wallace, Raymond Wallander, Thomas Walton, Shirley Watson, Eugene Watton, Joseph Weber, Lyle Welland, James West, Michael White, John Whitson, Joseph Williams, Charles Winquist, Norman Wright, Stanley Yates, John Yates, Michael Yaheka, Jeffrey Zimbricki, Leonard Zinda,
Preston Allen, Klaus Berg, John Blackburn, Francis Bramlett, Michael Buttigieg, John Burdett, Glenn Butler, James Calden, Richard Cardinale, Harvey Corey, Roger Courtney, Davidson Crumling, Daniel Darrington, Milton Dice, Frank Derbyshire, Peter Dewey, Frederick Delamuth, Thomas Drudy, Edward Duffy, Gerald Edmonds, Stephen Eldridge, Jimmy Elliott, Terrence Fairchild, Roderick Fast, Ronald Fain, Kenneth Fish, James Fluck, Thomas Fortunato, Gennardo Fumando, Donald George,
Robert Gerling,
Timothy Gilmore, Lawrence Glonick, John Gregory, David Grimley, Lannon Hart, Robert Harvey, Hubert Hatcher, Alan Hurd, James Hefner, Franklin Hill, Joseph Hilliard, James Hoffman, Paul Hoffman, John Hollander, Thomas Johnson, Fred Johnson, Hezekiah Johnson, Stephen Kelso, Robert Kennedy, Robert Kilbasa, Larry Kincaid, David Lemieux, Charles Lundy, Thomas Madsen, Edmund McGaldy, John Marbury, Daniel Marland, Michael McAllister, Michael McBurnett, Gerald McCollum, James McGovern, James Millott, Robin Miller, David Millett,
Roscoe Mitchell, Patrick Montana, Richard Montoro, Richard Morrow, John Natello, Donald Nelson, Timothy Nelson, Brian O'Connor, David O'Neill, Samuel Odo, Alvin Owen, Robert Owen, Larry Parr, John Patton, Carol Pender, Sammy Pentecost, Stephen Perry, Ernest Pierce, Bobby Pierce, Christopher Raddick, Robert Ratcliffe, Philip Rochester, Joseph Rodriguez, Kenneth Romer, Glenn Rogers, Charlie Rose, James Royal, George Charlo, William Serrett, Arland Shepard, James Simpson, Bobby Singley, Seth Sleezer, David Smith, Gary Smith, Paul Spitaleri, Thomas Stanson, Randall Steffen, Frank Stevens, David Tangeman, John Terrace, Thomas Thomas, Joseph Tom, John Toole, David Tout, Robert Treble, Ronald Vonsigern, Leonard Warnick, Edward Wasserman, William Watkins, Michael Wedzina, Lyle Weatherwax, Arnold Wilkins, Clayton Williams, Michael Willis, Charlie Winchester, Forrest Wolfname, Fred Wolfson, Ernest Wright, Jerome Yeager, John Yandel,
Eric Anderson, Michael Anderson, James Ascente, William Baker, Walter Barrick, David Beatty, Raymond Boisjoli, James Brown, David Kale, Richard Cogdell, Donald Cook, Larry Dixon, Marvin Duran, Jerry Everhart, Brian Eversman, Michael Fell, Robert Flynn, James Foyle, Laverne Geiger, Joel Goodall, John Hamilton, Charles Hensley, Charles Higginbottom, Gerald Hyman, John Hinshaw, Neil Heinz, Stephen Hunt, John Jensen, Noel Johnson, Eric Johnson, Michael Johnson, Thomas Jones, Raymond Judish, Michael Jump, John King, Robert Kinnan, Harold Keyser, Dudley Knapp, Daniel Labarge, Dennis Leans, Vincent Leogrande, Anthony Long, Peter McCauley, Kurt Minnick, George Monzi, Dennis Morgan, Keith Moriarty, Robert Moriarty, John Morris, Nicholas Passamonte, David Peliquin, Warren Peterson, Charles Pitchford, Michael Reynolds, Randolph Rohn, James Rigdon, Marion Robinson, Robin Rogers, Joseph Rogasich, Terry Rosenberger, Stephen Schilling, Courtney Schron, Elroy Schultz, Roman Serrano, Edward Silikowski, William Smeal, Hugh Smith, Stephen Smith, William Smith, Kenneth Taylor, Richard Tolley, Troy Wicker, Victor Wiedenberg, Gary Wolfe, William Wood, Richard Iopek, David Young,
Constantine Albans, William Anderson, Paul Baltzel, David Bartlett, Kevin Bedreau, Christopher Benedict, David Bowley, Thomas Burbrink, Thomas Bush, Robert Calvert, Henry Copland, Mark Coey, John Crow, James Downey, Joseph Ferenz, Jimmy Fine, Lawrence Flanagan, Frederick Fogel, Joseph Gallo, Thomas Gillespie, Paul Gulliver, Johnny Harris, Wallace Henderson, John Yunrizigzak, William Latour, James Lewis, Walter Moore, Gary Moser, John Murphy, Gary Peck, William Sadell, Larry Smalling, Wayne Wardwell, Carl Owl, Larry Bartell, Gary Barton, Norman Bowers, Brian Burke, Thomas Dubé, Robert Edrington, Kenneth Ewing, Jackson Findling, Arthur Fries, Miles Grafe, Sherald Guillory, Albury Heronchar, Thomas Hartsook, Norman Hinkle, Franklin Henson,
William Joyner, Ronald Kiersmakers, William Keyes, Keith Nepley, John Kwiatkowski, John Ledoux, Lee McDonald, Randall McGill, Wayne Meacham, Brian Moulier, Kurt Miller, William Pickett, Stephen Purchase, Douglas Riggs, Neil Ruick, John Simon, Gary Taggart, Charles Taylor, Dennis Troughton, Keith Vandegrift, Robert Watkins, Elmo Zumwalt III, James Anglin, Robert Ayers, James Bailey, Troy Baker, James Barber, Reginald Bennett, William Bowles, Richard Brecken, James Brown, Thomas Burgess, Warren Capel, Jeffrey Carmody, James Carpenter, Charlie Carter, James Conroy, Robert Douglas, Raymond Driver, Adrian Fish, Alan Frank, William Franklin, Robert George, Jerry Goff, Douglas Half, Steve Haney, Norman Hughes, Charles King, Vital LaMontagne, David Lambiote, James Leitz, Ronald Lilly, Richard Mack, Fred Mansk,
George McClellan, Richard McLaurin, Mike Miller, Leon Nichols, Howard Norton, Robert Olszewski, Charles Orndorff, Nelson Raschendorfer, Michael Sager, Victor Stoneburner, Thomas Thies, Michael Walsh, Joseph Weaver, Christopher Wilkinson,
Vincent Banda, Wayne Barfield, Gary Barth, Larry Bilyeu, Timothy Bogan Schultz, Wallace Buford, Robert Burton, Harry Bouchard, Ronald Bing, Herbert Carty, Anthony Carcia, Stephen Crotcher, Derek Francis, Larry Frank, Richard Franzik, Wayne Fungi, Daniel Greer, Dennis Gentner, Michael Grenier, Gregory Hairston, Gary Hammond, Randy Harold, Robert Kapczynski, Virginia Kirsch, Pete Luan, Joseph McCann, Stephen Mitchell, John Mullen, Carl Peoples, Paul Richardson, Henry Schroeder, William Shea, Clifton Sherrod, Peter Samokowski, Junior Stark, Walter Tanako, Daniel Watson, Robert Zackerson,
William Bates, John Bauer, John Bazan, Johnny Bowers, William Burroughs, Andrew Caudle, Dale Corwin, Theodis Davis, William DeLoreal, Roger East, Thomas Elliott, Jay Erickson, James Franklin, Joseph Friedman, Robert Gauthier, Paul Geary, Paul Gladden, Charles Glenn, John Gorick, Wenceslas Grace, William Green, Jeffrey Hansen, Glenn Hockaday, Evan Hutchick, John Joyce, Edward Coletta, Stephen Kelly, Colin Kelly, William Kiefer, Timothy Lejeune, Mark Leverton, James Logan, Frank Martinez, Larry Matz, James McClary, Juan Medina, James Mitchell, Eugene Monin, Joseph Mudd, Michael Murphy, Kenneth Nichols, Donald Parker, Ronald Sackey, George Sanford, John Schaefer, Billy Shepard, Dennis Soldner, Erwin Stander, Don Stigler, Alfred Terrian, Gerald Tone, John von Hock, James Weber, George Wildridge, Timothy Woods, Dennis Zahn,
Charles Abbott, Floyd Abney, Robert Abraham, Michael Ackerman, Charles Ackley, George Adair, Frank Aguilar, Kenneth Akins, Dewey Allen, Thomas Allen, Walter Almgreen, Francis Amato, Ronald Antkowiak, Clyde Ashley, Albert Albertine, Donald Austin, Everett Avery, David Babb, Donald Baird, Forney Ballard, Thomas Balliet, Ted Balliet, Lawrence Bamberg, Mark Barber, Ralph Barzano, Percy Bates, Harry Bowman, Nicholas Bay, Lynn Becker, Walter Bell, Harold Bergstrom, Kenneth Billings, Halford Bishop, Robert Blanchard, Michael Block, Nazio Bonino, Alan Boyd, Thomas Brennand, Walter Brennan, John Bretlinger, Richard Bright, Henry Brown, William Brown, Alan Bryant, Robert Bullard, Bobby Bunton, William Burke, Robert Burnett, Charles Burnett, Joseph Butler, Edward Calderwood, Robert Calhoun, Donald Caliendo, Frank Cambron, Dennis Campbell, Stuart Carlin, Larry Carter, John Casey, Leo Cawley, Ronald Chapman, Wayne Chesser, Vincent Ciampini, William Clark,
Richard Clark, James Clark, John Clark, Norman Collins, Harold Conger, Thomas Connors, Andrew Cook, Harry Corsetti, Rennie Corey, James Craig, Joseph Craig, Richard Craig, Donald Creamer, Michael Creamer, John Cruz, Frank Cross, Sandy Crowder, Joseph Cunningham, William Curry, John Curry, Thomas Daly, Gary David, Roger Davis, Harry Davison, Robert DeMulemeest, Larry Dean, Stephen Decker, Donald Dolsky, Gerald Dooley, Robert Doughty, John Dewell, James Duff, Paul Duffy, Samuel Duncan, David Eaton, Ronald Ebersol, James Edwards, Bruce Engel, William England, John Evans, Wayne Fairbairn, Norman Faur, William Farrow, Raymond Feltz, William Fennell, Robert Farrell, Kenneth Fewell, Oscar Fincher, Robert Flynn, Michael Four, Ralph Ford, Jeffrey Fowler, Richard Freeman, Jack Frost, Robert Fry, Richard Fryer, John Fulham, Keith Galloway, Thomas Garbarino, William Gard, Willard Garner, Keith Geisler, Richard Gibson, John Gibson,
James Gillespie, Anthony Gilmore, Paul Glass, Pedro Gonzalez, James Good, Gary Goodrich, Edward Graff, Gary Granger, George Grant, Thomas Greenberg, William Granat, Walter Griffin, Ralph Gwynn, Patrick Higgins, Donald Hagman, William Hain, Thomas Hall, Byron Hall, Roger Hamill, Virgil Hammond, Argyle Harper, Dallas Harper, Donald Harrison, Joseph Harvin, Gerald Hatterer, Thomas Hazard, Roy Hebert, Lee Hefner, Kenneth Hegman, James Hine, Donald Henderson, Jack Henshaw, George Harrelson, Robert Herschel, Mike Hickman, Robert Hilker, Daniel Hill, Heath Hill, Preston Hicks, Francis Hock, Thomas Hockmeyer, Louis Hopfner, Richard Hoko, Robert Howard, Harold Howell, James Howley, Robert Woolscamp, Roger Hula, Gary Inskeep, Arthur Jeffra, Ronald Jennings, Randall Jennings, Truman Johnson, David Johnson, James Jones, Keith Jones, Malcolm Jones, Thomas Joyce, David Uran, John Justice, Darrell Carl, Daniel Kelly, Scotty Kelly, Robert Kelsey,
Charles Kearns, Jerry Kidwell, John Kislewski, John Klein, Alan Knapp, Gregory Coe, Johnny Kotala, Frank Kohler, Marvin Cortexes, Peter Kraus, Ronnie Kraus, Donald Lapgard, William Larson, Billy Leach, Daniel Leach, Thomas Lee,
Dennis Leslie, Frank Lewis, Billy Lewis, David Lewis, Charles Lewis, Paul Lieberman, Ronald Lincoln, Theodore Lopez, Mark Lubrick, Marvin Lucan, Gerald Maddox, Eric Martz, Jack Manley, Francis Mann, Donald Mann, Richard Markowitz, George Martin, Grady Massingale, Jesse Mathias, Irwin Maya, Jerry McAvoy, Robert McClendon, Robert McClure, Jerry McCormick, John McCulloch, William McCurdy, Tommy McAmey, Jack McMichael, Joseph Mesiak, Charles Meese, James Meeks, Harold Meese, Carl Melton, James Merrill, Vernon Metcalf, Thomas Miller, Donald Mills, Eugene Moeller, William Monahan, David Montgomery, Daniel Moore, David Moose, Harrison Morgan, Richard Morris, Daniel Morrison, Gary Murphy, Carl Nation, Benjamin Navarro.
Terry Nodelsky, Jonathan Nelson, Lee Newman, Albert Knoll, Marvin Nolan, Richard Newt, Franklin Norris, John O'Brien, William O'Connell, Thomas O'Rourke, Arthur Oft, Alexander Ogrins, Eric Olaszewski, Laird Osborne, Melvin Ulster, George Ottery, Michael Palmedieri, Alan Popacek, Andrew Papp, Michael Parrott, Charles Patnod, Hubert Peed, David Peets, James Peters, Gerald Peterson, John Peterson, Dean Phillips, Thomas Phillips, Thomas Hobans, Robert Podogorski, Donald Poffenroth, David Porter, John Pose, Ronald Postawa, John Potenti, James Powell, Randall Prusaki, Arthur Putterbaugh, Terry Perdue, Edward Kesar, Kenneth Rakowski, John Ramsey, Stephen Ray, William Raybould, Charles Rader, Donald Remington, Kevin Renigan, Edwin Rhodes, Stephen Rice, Rodney Risch, Alfred Riddenhouse, Harold Riddenhouse, Michael Ricks, Marvin Robinson, Larry Robinson, John Rogan, Cletus Rooney, Antone Rosa, Mark Roth, Dennis Rudolph, John Sedlowski, James Sanders, Ronald Savage, Thomas Schreckengo,
Paul Scott, Marvin Say, Louis Sellers, Gary Sendick, John Shepard, William Siegel, Thomas Silha, Rodney Simmons, Stephen Simpson, Raymond Sinclair, Ralph Smith, Marvin Smith, Kenneth Smith Peters, Tommy Sneed, Jack Spicer, Michael Staub, Timothy Stakowski, William Stana, Stephen Steins, Thomas Schwartz, Gary Teku, Paul Tatum, Charles Terry, Carl Feller, Lonnie Tiller, William Toner, Robert Townsend, Francis Tracy, Robert Trigger, Jesus Trujillo, Gino Tuboli, Dallas Tudor, Eugene Turner, Henry Utterback, David Van Nort, Jerry Vanetti, Juan Villalobos, Harry Walker, Clifford Walters, Michael Ward, Richard Webb, Eugene Weems, Larry Wenkel, Paul Westmoreland, Thomas White, Lawrence White, Eddie White, David Witt, Daniel Wiggins, Frank Wilcox, William Williams, Dennis Williams, Roger Williams, Dale Williams, John Williamson, Tommy Wilson, Charles Wilson, Jimmy Wilson, Ronald Wilson, Gerald Wilson, George Henry Wise, Raymond Wisniewski, Gary Wolchuk, Michael Woods, Jonah Swersham,
Jesse Adams, Jack Adams, David Agnew, Agapito Alvarez, Robert Angus, George Arsenault, Larry Auerbach, Richard Austin, William Bacon, Ronald Baggett, Charles Bailey, John Baird, Ronald Ball, Michael Barnhill, Richard Barth, Kenneth Bartow, Lloyd Benton, Raymond Burling, Charles Blackham, Harry Bohr, William Borden, Charles Borgstrom, James Branch, Henry Brawley, Peter Brose, Robert Burke, Joseph Campbell, Ricardo Carmona, Jackie Carver, William Charlton, Carl Christie, Maurice Cooper, Lennis Corey, James Cowles, Harold Cox, Scott Craven, Charles Cullison, David DeCourcy, William Dean, Dominic DiGregorio, Thomas Drazel, Michael Duffy, John Dool, Truman Easterling, John Elm, Ed Embry, Robert Erickson, William Fairchild, Dixon Farron, Samuel Fitzpatrick, Ralph Flanagan, Dixon Fletcher, John Frith, Joseph Frew, Donald Gannon, Robert Gerling, George Godfrey, Thomas Grosser, Roger Gunning, Keith Halda, Robert Hamilton, Michael Hargis, Samuel Hatton, Homer Hayes, Joseph Heath, Arvo Hakilla, James Henderson, Jesse Hennig, Kermit Hibner, Thomas Heeb, James Hinton, Charles Hohenstein, James Hood, Robert Horvath, Robert Hughes, Sisosi Isaacs, Phil Jackson, Warren Jackson, Robert Yeager, Gregory Jazarian,
Stanley Johnson, John Johnson, Stephen Jones, Roger Geordie, Daniel Kane, Michael Karch, Richard Kirkove, Donald Keeman, John King, Harold Costin, Joseph Craddockville, Joseph Krauska, Larry Kuker, Quentin Larson, Stanley Larson, Daryl Larson, Adam Legg, Clarence Leverage, Glenn Lloyd, James Marshbank, Van Martin, Ronald Martin, Donald Mason, Robert McElhenney, Lewis McKinley, Henry Mesa, Bobby Mewborn, Donald Meyer, John Meyer, James Miller, Anthony Minatola, Billy Moore, Joseph Mulher, Thomas Mullen, Donald Myers, David Nelson, Robert Newell, Harry Newitt, Christ Nicholas, Thomas Nichols, John Norton, James O'Donnell, Henry Ox, Robert Oliva, David Oliva, Thomas Olson, Robert Pekowski, Gary Peel, Armando Perales, Thomas Perry, Deward Picorni, Charles Poole, Frederick Poesiak, Edward Purcell, Joseph Cortuccio, William Ringnell, Joseph Roschlich, Gregory Rasmussen, Melvin Rebels, Barry Reddington, Thomas Rice, Harold Rice, Fred Roberto,
James Robinson, Gary Rossman, Richard Rung, Brian Russo, Chester Salvia, William Sawchick, Ronald Schwagart, Max Searle, Stephen Serac, Donald Shipley, Harold Shoemaker, John Smith, Jeffrey Smith, Gary Smith, David Solik, Juan Soto, John Soxie, William Stafford, Lee Stark, Dennis Starr, Dennis Starzinger, Donald Stebbins, Clifford Stearns, Stephen Svets, George Swearingen, Gerald Swiggett, Donald Talberg, Timothy Taylor, Kenneth Thompson, David Thompson, George Tideman, Robert Trask, Donald Trent, William Turk, Francis Turney, Roger Varhold, Ralph Vaughn, Billy Von Weldon, Robert Wagner, Daniel Walker, Clarence Wenrick, Louis Westerberg, John Wheatley, George Whiten, James Wise, Joseph Wise, J. Wolverton, Ronald Wright, John Zell, William Zellner,
Arthur Bachman, Christopher Bowser, James Baltras, Leo Barnaby, George Barnett, George Bartol, George Beck, George Bennett, Charles Billings, Paul Bogar, William Borrow, Edward Brannon, Philip Brennigan, Stanley Brenton, Alan Butler, Stephen Campbell,
Robert Kaplan, Paul Casares, John Clemens, David Cornelius, James Kozier, Gary Costello, Donald Cunningham, Rudd Davis, Dennis DeJoule, Thomas Dare, Daniel Dulbo, Kenneth DeHamel, Robert Dudley, Jimmy Dudley, Michael Duff, Donald Dummis, Arthur Edwards, Russell Amen, William Evans, Terry Farmer, Thomas Frank, Theodore Frost, Michael Gall, David Gibson, Olin Gill, Edward Gillen, Thomas Goodrich, John Gorman, Robert Grace, John Graff, Robert Grass, Willard Green, Gerald Grismala, Dean Gunn, Wilbur Gunzelman, Richard Hall, Thomas Hanson, Donald Hassler, Richard Hazeltine, Alan Hodgson, Gregory Hoffmeister, John Hogan, Hassel Holt, Ronald Howard, Raymond Iwanowski, Thomas Jennings, Terrell Johnson, George Justice,
Dennis Kank, Timothy Comiskey, Truzel Kelly, Dale King, Charles Koppel, Joseph Kovac, William Cressley, Randy Langworthy, Michael Larkin, James Lavis, Ronald Lawrence, James Lawrence, Stephen Lewin, Jimmy Little, James Lorenzo, Kenneth Lucas, Theodore Macris, Robert Malachowski, Gary Markle, Thomas McCloskey, Isaac McFadgen, Bernard McGarvey, Robert McIntosh, Douglas McNeese, James Michael, Charles Miska, Henry Moore, Mark Morin, Scott Morris, Jonathan Muntener, Jerry Neff, Robert Noel, Patrick O'Mara, Larry Osborne, Daniel Papp, Stephen Parker, Lawrence Parsons, Terry Patient, Charles Peatfish, Curtis Peterson, Eric Peterson, Carl Peterson, Grant Pitcher, Stephen Pitts, Lewis Quick, John Register, Dennis Rice, Carl Ropos, Kevin Rosinski, Richard Standistevan, Richard Saylor, Gerald Schmitz, Michael Scott, Thomas Sedlicek, Robert Shanahan, Robert Simpson, Gail Skinner, Billy Smith, Claude Smith, Sandy Snyder, Arnold Spitzer, Michael St. Germain, Alan Stern, John Stewart.
Woodland Styron, Stephen Sucomelli, Douglas Sulek, William Swartz, Lawrence Taylor, Roy Thomas, Frank Tincher, Aubrey Townsend, Robert Blamink, Arthur Wade, Larry Waltrip, Donald Waterman, Delbert Watkins, James Welter, Robert Williamson, Jesse Wilson, Dale Wilson, Milton Wood, David Ackerman, Michael Akins, Richard Allen, Nels Anderson, Roy Antonini, William Bartow, Edward Bergseth, Henry Biernacki, Jack Bradley, Dennis Bratz, Thomas Burbridge, Robert Carley, Jimmy Carmichael, Charles Clark, Warren Collins, Cecil Cook, Henry Covington, Cecil Daniels, Truzel Duramus, Neil Dixon, Henry Ferris, Richard Feisthamel, Wayne Frank, Michael Frost, Danny Garland, Donald Gokenauer, Alan Goring, Louis Gordon, Jose Gurule, Francisco Gutierrez, John Hiltner, Thomas Holland,
Levi Horn, Dennis Husband, James Jansen, Albert Jones, James Kakaitis, Vincent Kelly, Bahuslav Kostka, Daniel Kuttner, Michael Kuzmicki, James Lang, Paul Lawrence, Richard Legrand, Tommy Marjoram, Gavin Mason, Kenneth McCaskill, William McHale, Frank Mickus, James Millen, Frank Miller, Paul Mitchell, Terry Mitchell, Lamont Moody, Jerome Moore, Harold Murphy, Patrick O'Donnell, Dean Pape, Salvatore Paternico, Billy Piercy, Robert Quinn, Leo Rawhenhorst, James Reeder, Raymond Reeves, Kenneth Roberts, Jesus Salgado, Charles Savage, Kenneth Seaman, Warren Seymour, Frank Shelmet, Monty Smith, Ernest Stedman, Wayne Swinson, Ernest Taylor, Gregory Thayer, Larry Tremblay, William Trott, Brian Van Washnova, Donald Vasswing, Charles Vian, James Warrington, Douglas Webster, Leroy Whaler, Donald Wells, William Wheeler, Melvin Wright,
John Allers, Ronald Anderson, John Arkenberg, Leon Atwater, Norman Bays, James Berger, Harold Boyce, Lucian Boylston, Michael Crawford, Howard Cusick, Dennis DeBolt, Anthony DeMella, Kevin Donahue, Richard Downs, William Dudenbostel, Paul Dunn, Elliot English, Armand Fleury, Darcy Freeman, John Garber, Thomas Grassa, Andrew Grimes, Robert Grossley, Frank Guzzi, Robert Hamill, Don Hampton, Harold Harding, Margaret Haskin Rose, Ronald Holter, Thomas Johnson, William Jones, Donald Caberline, Cameron Keister, Louis Kelso, Paul Kirkman, Frederick Lance, Larry Lee, Alan Logan, John Henry Lunn, Eugene Marbiter, Maynard Mayberry, James McGinn, Walter Mealy, Leslie Moon, William Morgan, Charles Moreau, Carl Most, Carl Nitsch, William Noah, Calvin Ollis, Charles Patton, William Pletcher, Raymond Pomeroy, Gary Reed, David Riccio, Richard Rice, John Rood, Ronald Rose, Dominic Rotolo, Johnny Salas, John Schwartz, George Shirley, Richard Simpson, Thomas Sizer,
James Starks, Elliot Stewart, Kenneth Taylor, Harrison Thompson, Lawrence Thompson, Thomas Thompson, William Wallace, Thomas Wally, David Walsh, Stephen Wedding, Sammy Weinstock, Glenn Wessel, Curtis Wilkerson, James Wright, James Abbott, Milo Adams, Charles Bales, Joseph Barnes, Glenn Beckwith, Roger Bernacki, Keith Blackman, Paul Blosser, William Borowski, Albert Boutwell, Clifford Briggs, William Broxson, Richard Busili, Jerry Bergen, Lonnie Carter, Everett Chadbourne, Vincent Chitron, Frederick Copley, Leslie Cottle, Richard Colomby, John Dell, John Fields, Richard Frankowiak, Lonnie Garrison, Richard Gentry, Brian Gunderson, George Haas, Lawrence Hackett, Ronald Hagan, William Hare, Larry Hall, Julius Harding, William Herman, Patrick Hukill, Gary Jacks, Joseph Jacobs, Richard Johnson, Charles Johnson, Donald Jones, Thomas Kelly, Arthur Kidney, Owen King, Tommy King, Thomas Kingan, Donald Link, William Litton, Charles Lord, Leonard Lordy,
John Lyons, James Manwaring, Jimmy McFarling, Gerard McManus, James McWilliams, Gary Meadows, Brian Meadows, Frank Moffett, Frederick Morgan, David Morris, Kevin Murphy, Harry Nez, Timothy Plaskett, Alfred Ramirez, Robert Redmond, Stephen Sequist, Ralph Slaughter, Lawrence South, William Stewart, Robert Tate, Roger Taylor, Owen Tomlinson, Walter Vitter, Billy Walkabout, Ted Wiggs, Kenneth Wilkes, Francis Wing, James Wright, Robert Zillinger, Lloyd Abel, Leo Allen, Dennis Ashby, Philip Badger, Jerry Baker, Dennis Ballard, Frank Bassrab, Ronald Becker, Douglas Byrne, Douglas Buchan, Linda Buckley, Peter Berghardt, Louis Cody, Russell Coleman, Joseph Corbin, Dale Coffiner, John D'Ottavio, Robert Dalton, Davis Darbone, John Davila, Edgar Day, Michael DeCamp, Raymond DeThorne, James Decker, Gregory Demiduck, Sean Doherty, Terrence Donick, Richard Downey, George Emery, Carl Engel, Michael Engler, Lawrence Evans,
Ronald Fabick, Albert Fendali, George Flannery, Michael Ford, Dean Fowler, Otis Glenn, Leonard Gravino, Charles Hall, George Harris, Richard Hatzenbuehler, Stanley Hudson, James Hunt, Kenneth Jarman, Dean Johnson, William Johnstone, Terrence Kemp, Charles Key, Robert Krause, Kirk Creamer, Max Leitz, Louis Lickfield, Robert Mocker, David Marsh, Bernard McLean, Perry McCulpin, Richard McCowan, Richard McKeegan, Charles McLaughlin, Kevin McLaughlin, Ellis Meadows, Michael Meadows, Stephen Merrican, John Messer, Danny Miller, Paul Moran, Frank John Molnickel, Marvin Nestor, Julian Norris, Gerald Oland, John Olson, John Olsonecki, Gregory Otto, Paul Perez, Jimmy Pugh, Richard Post, John Reinhardt, Woodrow Rentis Blanco, Homer Reynolds, Paul Riddlebarger, Ronald Reneker, Harold Roberson, William Robinson, Richard Rogers, Roberto Romero, Joseph Rousseau, Juan Ruiz, Benjamin Russell, Kai Solano, Dale Sayre, Paul Surratt, Ralph Somm, James Sawtell, Ronald Shuck, Robert Service,
Stephen Shepard, Roy Shepard, Stan Searmans, Jackie Slemp, Lloyd Smith, Joseph Snyder, Gerald Spath, Robert Spindler, James Stevens, Jimmy Stepp, Jerome Stevens, Robert Stevenson, William Stolarczyk, John Sullivan, Herschel Tanner, Russell Bigliotti, Francis Vining, Peter Vosbokis, Damian Vegasky, Carol Wilkie, Roderick Wills, Chester Wolfe, Paul Yesk, James Alexander, Dalton Alexander, Craig Anderson, Bobby Baker, Jerry Barlow, Malcolm Bauer, Teddy Bunnell, Chance Ron Cannon, Thomas Capaxioni, George Carter, George Chandler, Fred Simmerman, Samuel Cochran, David Conway, Philip Cooper, Andrew Davies, Thomas Davies, Michael Dirth, Jerry Degnan, Jacob Drager, Honorees Duncan, John Evanson, Lowell Falconbury, Gary Faduke, Larry Fines, William Foreman, Jeffrey Gardner, Dennis Gazale, William Gibbs, Michael Gregorski, Kenneth Gu, Dennis Gump.
Charles Hancock, Robert Hanover, Edward Pete Harrison, Donald Havey, Donald Hedges, William Heggie, Charles Henry, Dennis Hickman, Gary Hill, Jared Huff, Jeffrey Hutchinson, David Johnson, John Johnson, Stanley Cates, James Killeran, Jerry Klein, Robert Crisco, Stanley Kuchlewski, Alan Kurtz, Barry MacArthur, Donald McCanns, Robert McGuffin, Kenneth McGuire, John McKay, Billy McPherson, Richard Moore, Thomas Morrison, Arvin Mortensen, James Murray, Anthony Musto, Darrell Olhoff, and Joseph Pioni, Alan Paré, Jackie Patterson, Wayne Polisi, Dominic Pinardo, Bruce Peters, Hardy Phipps, William Pierce, David Pistachio, Larry Poirier, Max Prentice, Ira Pretty, Terry Prout, Wilfred Ricard, Jimmy Rogers, Teddy Roseberry, Jose Sanchez, Charles Shirtleff, Frank Siegfried, Ross Snare, William St. John, Donald Staley, Michael Tremmel, James Tyson, Leslie Beats, Dale Vincent, Holly Walker, Tommy Walker, William Wall, Jay Welschler, Harold Wicke, George Ochahotz, Stephen Zardi, Anthony Zavarelli,
Glenn Adams, John Alcama, Angelo Amoroso, Keith Anderson, Lewis Anderson, Dennis Banks, Howard Bars, William Beaver, Carl Berglund, Richard Brown, Gregory Brown, Frank Campanaro, Robert Cape, Richard Copenhaver, James Cordray, Joseph Cornish, Hildra Chris, Don Crum, Anthony Davis, Lauren Davis, John Dowley, George Douglas, Anthony Gematruis, Howard Eady, Stephen Emery, James Doc Feliciano, George Fiedler, Sandy Foster, Ronald Faust, Robert Freeman, James Fernie, Gerald Garcia, Alan Gehring, David Giglio, Norman Graham, Henry Gregg, Alan Hale, Randall Hines, Joseph Hingham, Charles Hubish, Thomas Hay, George Himmelberger, Willard Hines, Glenn Howell, John Ignash, Donald James, Robert Johnson, Jerome Kelch, Herschel Knighton, Joseph Kenke, Ronald McKenzie, Michael Malakowski, Daniel Maloney, Gary Marte, John Martinez, Alan Maxwell, James McMaster, David McNerney, Fred Metting, Jimmy Miller, Francis Miller, George Milligan, Alan Moore, Francisco Morales,
Adolfo Morales Melendez, William O'Connor, Ray Pace, Hugh Palmer, John Pollitt, Keith Ryder, James Rhyme, Eugene Rommel, Gregory Russell, Irvin Schnitzler, James Swantz, Joseph Shelsky, William Short, Herbert Sink, Dennis Slibby, Edward Smith, Thomas Snyder, Ronald Sokolovich, William Tammy, Robert Taylor, Joseph Taylor, Elwood Tipton, William Vasson, Michael Wakefield, Michael Weber, Stephen Wilbur, John Wilkinson, Jerry Williams, Delmer Williams, Harry Williamson, Douglas Wood, Joseph Amonte, James Arsenault, Stephen Atchley, Eugene Bernius, Merle Bissell, Robert Bowser, James Bronny, Mark Bridges, William Brown, John Burr, Henry Caridio, Kenneth Carlson, Stanley Casper, Russell Casson, Charles Chafin, Donald Clifton, Dale Code, George Cornelius, Harold Coey, John Davis, Wesley Davis, Randall Dinsmore, Michael DeJean, Terrell Elliott, Robert Farmer, Walker Fox, Gary Garner, James Gift, Robert Gillis, Richard Nagy, Michael Green, Virgil Green,
Michael Greshawak, Frank Grimes, Robert Govermont, Lloyd Hendrick, John Hess, Charles Hicks, Delbert Hobbs, Alan Howardell, Manuel Herta, Paul Iavetti, Donald Isaacs, Marshall Yeager, Thomas Kane, Gerald Keinberg, George Lamb, Jr., Charlie Lane, Kenneth Logenslager, Jerome Lemke, Robert Lum, Harry Mackle, Jr., Paul Martinez, John Mata, Jr., Charles McElhaney, Arthur Mackenzie, William McCann, Stanley Mills, Willard Mitchell, Raymond Mitchell, Vincent Monticelli, William Montrefus, Henry Nito, Jerry Olstein, William Palmer, Roger Pickett, William Poole, Gary Puckett, Timothy Quain, John Regan, Kent Reinbach, Jack Ritchie, Larry Rodman, Louis Rossells, Jr., Max Rosenberg, Joseph Salas, Jesse Saxon, David Scarno, Anthony Shiliak, Gerald Schewers, James Scott, Elmer Serini, Jimmy Shepard, Jewel Simmons, Floyd Simmons, Jr., Thomas Sneed, Stephen Snodgrass, Larry Snow, Garen Sparks, Kenneth Spina, Russell Sitzler, Raymond Thompson, Charles Wicksburg, Alvin Wubels, Richard Yard,
John Abbott, Don Allen, John Barrett, Stephen Bellis, Gary Bennett, Harold Bentley, Robert Benzio, Jimmy Bradley, Warren Bray, Frederick Brester, Kenneth Brunel, Gary Berta, Theodore Cantrell, Theodore Caruso, Paul Cawthon, John Christensen, Colin Coughlin, James Cuthbertson, Charles D'Amico, Jerome DeJean, William Desmond, Larry Dodd, Bobby Engel, Ralph Ennis, James Flo, Gary Floyd, Jerry Foster, Bernard Foyle, Regis Franciscus Jr., Donald Gardner, Marvin Gebhardt, Ronald Goodwin, Victor Gorlinski, Randall Gray, Jerry Griffith, Lyman Harris, James Henderson, Melvin Hensley, Brian Hill, Richard Hoffman, Elmer Hogan, Grady Howard, Lee Hurto, Russell Jeffs, James Jennings, Marshall Johnson, Joseph Kaler, Thomas Kelly, Robert Kennedy, Sylvester Kennedy, William Kirk, Bernard Kleiderline, David Costin, Richard Crumvieta, George Lanter, Michael Lipka, Francis Markovic, Arthur Martin, William Massey, Leonard Maxwell, James McKernan, Harold McPherson, Bobby Michael, Brent Miller,
Frederick Morgan, James Morsey, William Muller, Charles Mernan III, Thomas Murray, Gerald Murray, Ronald Moody, David Newhouse, John Noss, Orville Olson, Mario Petiti, Joseph Pettit, Paul Prebish, Stuart Price, Jimmy Pruitt, James Rattery.
Richard Roachkolb, Normand Raymond, James Reed, Raymond Reike, John Reyes, George Rhodes, Gilbert Ryder, Wilton Robertson, Hugo Roca, Larry Rogers, Kevin Root, Donald Rose, Lynn Ross, Wallace Schmidt, Larry Scott, Charles Seddon, Andrew Sharp, Daniel Shea, Wilson Simpson, Richard Smith, Dallas Stevenson, Edward Steiger, Raymond Takelet, James Tate, Glenn Thorson, Ralph Thusen, Wayne Tissinger, Larry Troop, Edwin Unger II, Melvin Valentine, Darrell Warfel, Carl White, Charles White, Richard Williams, Donald Williams, Emmanuel Williams, William Wilson, Richard Yancey, Jackie Young, Patrick Alexander, Thomas Angelos, Robert Bonazic, Paul Bobo, James Bowden, Carl Boff, Dennis Brady, John Brosovich, Dean Boole, Floyd Burchett, James Burns, Charles Carey, Vincent Chavez, John Chess, Frederick Shequin, James Clark,
Ovie Clark, Charles Clark, Dennis Coble, Larry Cole, David Condren, William Bill Cooney, William Cornwell, Teddy Craven, Eldon Krause, Kevin Dale, Paul Davis, Gunnar Davis, Dallas Dixon, David Douglas, Edwin Driscoll, Daniel Drury, Frank Elliott, Paul Facklum, Douglas Fawcett, Donald Fichter, James Freud, Alan Gatesman, Frederick Gersh, Thomas Graham, Charles Hanson, Gary Harding, Michael Harger, John Hecker, Dennis Hewitt, Vaughn Hilgren, Arthur Hinch, Thomas Jacobson, Alan James, Gary Johnson, David Johnson, Walter Jones, Thomas Kelly, Terry Kent, William Klimek, Sheldon Klink, Robert Konopka, Rijard Laba, Marvin Lemley, Joseph Lopez, Clarence Mack, Eugene Magnuson, Michael Mallory, Eduardo Marquez, Varney Massey, Richard McCraw, Bonnie McWilliams, Danny McWilliams, Patrick Michael, James Miller, William Mintler, William Morton, Robert Mott, Richard Naylor, John Nash, Rondell Nelson, James Nye, Michael Obrecht, George Olenek, Raymond Olero,
Melvin Overbay, Bruce Pascal, John Paul, Charles Phelan, Robert Pope, Charles Powell, Clyde Price, Edwin Reed, James Resch, Carl Regill, Michael Rossler, Gilbert Rowan, Michael Ruberti, Joseph Ruggiero, Samuel Salinas, Lonnie Sanders, Bernard Schneider, Gerald Schneider, Philip Saylor, John Scahill, Michael Smentkowski, Marlon Smith, Carrie Smith, Ernest Smith, John Smith, Antonio Suarez, Jesse Spencer, Robert Stafford, Jerry Stanley, Dwight Stanley, Donald Stokes, Roger Stone. Michael Strickland, Ronald Testad, Robert Teed, Robert Teague, Joseph Timpano, Arthur Torres, William Trainer, Daniel Vasquez, Frank Verdon, Robert Veradenberg, Richard Wagner, Frederick White, Russell Whitman, Patrick Wright, David Wuckert, Robert Yancey. Paul Yaramain, George Zablaika, Richard Zanuck.
Harold Abbey, Britt Adair, Joel Aguano, Dwayne Alger, Wilbur Anderson, Mark Anderson, David Anderson, William Anson, Ted Agron, Jerry Armstrong, Alan Baker, Melvin Banthroll, Mike Barkowek, Craig Barton, David Bean, Thomas B. Paul Bell, William Bender, Danny Bennett, Joseph Bora, Gilmer Branch, Donald Burnell, Robert Burns, Leslie Burr, Edwin Butler, Max Camberos, Robert Cameron, Dennis Capron, James Cantonese, Donald Childers, Nicholas Scirocco, Craig Colby, Gary Cole, Richard Contreras, Domingo Cornelio, John Corrigan, Renee Kuhlman, Fred Crestall, D. L. Crowell, Edward Daniel, James Davidson, Bobby DeSasia, Carmen de Cruz, William Daling, Frederick Douglass, John DeBrille, James Dunlop, J.D. Eagle, Dennis Edwards, Alan Eitel, Frank Ille, Lawrence Elkins, David Fahey, Antonio Farinella, William Fesco, Salvatore Gallo, Jimmy Gilbert, Robert Green, Robert Grafey, Jack Goulden, Leigh Gwynn, Leslie Hare, David Hale, Theodore Hall.
Randolph Hamlin, Jack Harney, Bruce Hartman, Jack Hedgelin, Clifford Herman, Richard Hilton, Henry Hoffman, Carol Hokinson, Lester Hoover, James Horvath, James Howells, William Ibaugh, Michael Janis, Noel Janvey, Norman Johnson, Kenneth Johnson, David Jones, Lee Jones, Dennis Kelly, James Kennedy, Gary Knight, Paul Kofsky, Lloyd Krupp, Stanley Kukla, James Lane, Michael Leone, Terry Leslie, Walter Leva, John Lenardi, Ricky Lofton, Robert Long, Carl Long, James McGregor, Harold Marcus, Robert Oslowski, Raymond Moore, Joseph McCabe, John McCabe, Daniel McCarthy, Michael McCartney, Ronald McCarty, Charles McCentifer, Lowell Beecham, Melvin Mellom, Douglas Miller, Joseph Mingus, Wayne Morris, Lloyd Murayama, Gary Nelms, Donald Nickel, Carol Noland, Leon Nowitzki, Richard Orico, Michael Otto, Bruce Owen, Patrick Palumbo, Lester Payton, Richard Peliquin, Charles Perkins, Jackie Petrosky, Richard Pettit, Lionel Pinn, Paul Poker, James Pope,
Thomas Posey, Francisco Primignano, James Ralston, Roger Ratzliff, Michael Reagan, Dennis Reedy, Stephen Rasheen, Stanley Roberts, John Roderick, Dallas Rowe, Robert Rogers, Luis Rosas Luca, Frank Schaefer, Roger Shear, Gerald Segerson, Gary Soldow, Max Suggs, William Tatum, Donald Teague, Ronald Tyrion, Donald Tipton, Raymond Upchurch, Johnny Van Treese, Julius Verde, Donald Virali, John Van Essen, Terry Wagner, John Wallace, Michael Walsh, Rozier Watts, Leonard Weiss, William Westerman, Phillips Wheatley, Robert White, Robert Wilson, George Young, Douglas Young, Herbert Abels, Joseph Adamski, John Anderson, George Engerbrandt, James Ansley, Charles Ashley, Cleburne Atwell, Robert Austin, Arlen Balls, George Barrett, Jerry Bascom, Clinton Bissett, Arthur Bagan, Anthony Benner, Donald Bennett, Wayne Berry,
David Betty, Arthur Bialaskursky, Robert Blakely, Kenneth Bloom, Rodney Bluchell, Joseph Boback, Ralph Bolin, Ronald Booth, Thomas Boren III, Joseph Borgwin, Thomas Brock, Peter Brown, LaVoice Bryant, Kevin Buckley, Jimmy Bullock, Thomas Butcher,
James Buzzell, Henry Carter, William Castleberry, Robert Castor, Roy Chambers, Walter Cheatham, Richard Clark, Marcellus Klein, Edward Conley, Claude Connor, Albert Corvue, Nelson Couch, Robert Craycoff, Stephen Croft, Charles Crone, Russell Crossman, Merle Crutcher, Dennis Daddock, Ronald Dallas, James Dare, Royce Davenport, Carmi Davidson, Everett Davidson, Kenneth Defoe, Robert Delaney, Gregory Deutsch, Malvin Dickinson, Richard Dillon, Joseph Donatone, John Donnelly, Herman Downs, Dennis Drebert, Henry Driver, Edgar Duker, Michael Dunlap, Stephen Aves, Robert Edwards, Frank Elbertson, Marvin Erb, William Eubanks, Charles Evans, Charles Everett, Brian Everman, Peter Fargy, Jared Fassler, Jack Ferguson, Carl Ferguson, Richard Fifield, William Finken, Larry First, David Fisher, William Fisher, Carl Fitchie, Frank Fulcari, Patrick Francis, Richard Fronauer, Michael Fontiera, Philip Gable, Joseph Gagliardo, Harvey Gagnon, Ernest Garrard, George Garcia, Claude Goebel, Daniel Gogol,
David Gonkar, David Gould, Richard Greenier, Robert Gruber, Benny Grunn, Thomas Guffey, John Hall, Michael Ham, Dennis Hammond, Michael Hamrick, Charles Harding, Roy Harris, David Haskell, Robert Heckman, James Hyman, Michael Hemphill, James Hankey, William Henline, Paul Hensley, Craig Higashiyama, Michael Hill, Daniel Hutch, James Hodge, Melvin Hopkins, Everett Howe, Warren Hove, Emery Hooty, John Hughes, James Hurt, Glenn Johnson, Douglas Johnson, Lynn Johnson, Walter Jones, William Jordan, Don Jewink, Mark Kilty, John Kelly, Donald Kennedy, George Keogh, Wayne Key, Weldon Keemon, Robert Kidwell, Milton Kenny, Ralph Kirby, Gary Klingel, Gerald Kunkel, Salvatore Lafata, David Luck,
Kenneth Lambert, Kirk Lane, Richard Lang, Charles Larson, Ronald Laufman, Larry Letterman, Guy Lewis, Richard Lighthall, Ellsworth Little, James Logston, Juan Lopez, Ricky Lowe, Douglas Lowry, Paul McGuire, Ronald Maple, Roger Mason, Anthony Matola, Daniel Morrow, Robert Mawhinney, George McComsky, Earl McKinley, Michael McLean, Clifford McNaught, Dennis Medetsky, Albert Miller, Gregory Miller, Thomas Miller, Gary Minkler, James Mogan, William Mooney, Lawrence Moore, Gerald Moore, Kenneth Morgan, Jerry Morgan, Jerry Mudd, John Mulledy, Robert Murphy, Christopher Murphy, Thomas Nagel, Kevin Neely, Lonnie Nevitt, Eddie Newell, Ollie Nichols, John Nix, Wayne Noller, James Norman, Donald Norris, Barry Norton,
Frank Nowicki, Michael O'Brien, Robert O'Brien, Stanley Oliver, Eugene Ordaz, Daniel Owen, Richard Pace, Miguel Pacheco, Louis Packard, Richard Pachevsky, Joseph Palente, John Parisi, William Pascal, Russell Patton, Dallas Peterson, Charles Perkins,
Jimmy Perkins, Flory Perrone, Dennis Perry, Anthony Peters, Gregory Peterson, Peter Philhauer, Clifford Phillips, William Perangeli, Kenneth Pullman, Olaf Pokrajak, Paul Pillafrone, Arthur Pont, Alan Price, David Preby, Tommy Province, Thomas Provincial, Angelo Pomelo, Peter Petrino, Francis Rabideau, Dwayne Reed, Michael Redden, Dennis Reinhold, Vern Reynolds, Thomas Richards, William Richards, Fred Richmond, Robert Risky, Johnny Robbins, Gerald Roberts, Henry Robinson, Roger Rawlings, Nicholas Ruland, Robert Sanders, John Santer, Robert Sauer, Arthur Schaefmayer, Dominic Schiavone, Terry Schloesser, James Selner, Richard Sendler, Gordon Shaw, Robert Shelton, George Shukla, Sal Silva, Donald Simon, Paul Simoneau, Richard Simpson, Thomas Sims, Anthony Slomsky, Kennedy Smith, James Smith, Roy Smith, Edward Smith, James Smith, Charles Souther, James Spence, Jeffrey Stainer, William Stewart, William Stone, Luther Sullivan, David Surgis, Edward Swager, Willis Taylor, David Tabordo,
Dennis Thyman, Terry Thompson, James Thompson, Roger Thorne, John Tomaino, Stephen Torres, Grady Usry, Robert Valentine, Floyd Valine, Charles Vaughn, John Wade, Richard Wager, James Waldron, Marvin Walther, William Warner, William Watland, Frankie Weaver, Dennis Weber, Howard Wendell, Riley Westerfield, Larry Westerfield, Carrie White, Dale Williams, Michael Williams, Donald Wilson, John Wilson, Otho Winchester, Daniel Wing, Ronald Wise, Gary Wolfe, William Wolfe, Thomas Wood, David Wright, Grayson Yeater, Clyde Young, George Ubetta, Donald Zabawa, Michael Zimmerman, James Zimmerman,
Jesus Acosta, Gail Alden, Bobby Allen, David Anderson, Ralph Angeletti, Gary Atchison, David Atwood, Robert Austin, Danny Baca, Stephen Bacon, William Bailey, Harold Bailey, Boyd Bandy, John Baranowski, David Barkovich, Robert Barrett, George Barton, Michael Bashta, James Beck, Albert Bedard, Walter Beese, Kenneth Bell, Johnny Bennett, Kenneth Bennett, Donald Bennett, Lawrence Benson, John Besterfield, Nicholas Belinsky, Danny Black, Stephen Bloxam, Robert Bowley, Felix Bonilla, Daniel Botek, Norman Bowden, Roy Bowren, Charles Boyd, Charles Boyette, Wazel Bozidaj, Taras Bozidaj, John Braden, Jerry Bradford, Jimmy Bradley, Walter Brady, James Breeden, Howard Brinkerhoff, Steve Brooks, Daniel Brooks, John Brooks, Ronald Brown, Michael Brown, David Bryson, Kelly Burke, Robert Burkhart, Robert Burris, Julio Butler, John Burns, Timothy Cannon, William Cannon, George Carr, Richard Carroll, Russell Casadonte, Timothy Casey, William Castle, Pedro Castillo,
Donnie Chasteen, Arvel Claybo, Ronald Klassen, Stanley Clayman, Arthur Cochran, Bruce Cole, Francis Collins, John Collins, Ronnie Combs, Ronnie Comer, Wilbur Conway, Jacob Cooter, Doyle Cothran, Devin Kripe, Robert Crocker, Roger Cunningham, Francis Cunningham, Harold Curtis Jr., Stephen Cutler, Richard Dalton, Willard Davenport, Eugene Davis, Philip Davis, Robert Davis Sr., Clinton Dean, Kevin Delaney, Michael Deline, Arthur Demopoulos, Daniels Dennis Sr., Robert Dietzman, Michael Dillard, David Dillon, Thomas Dorian, Leo Dozier, George Draper, Jean Drost, Nicholas Dudick, Vincent Duenas, Thomas Dunnington, Joseph Duval, Frank Deisler, Raymond Early Jr., Larry Eckhart, Patrick Eddy, Richard Engelson, Gunnard Eskelson, Richard Evans, Francis Fagan, Gene Farmello, Harold Farver Sr., Lloyd Faulkner, John Fagan, Michael Fennell, Marvin Ferguson, Alan Finnell, Gerald Fitzenberger, Lyle Fitzgerald, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Roger Ford, Anthony Foster, Stuart Fraser, Richard Frederking, Luther Freeman, Bernard Friel,
Irvin Frost, Harold Fuller, Dennis Furtaw, Arthur Gainier, Marilyn Gardner, Jerry Garrett, Bruce Gassler, Franklin Getter, Francis Jamo, William Glantz, George Goebel, Adolfo Gonzalez, James Grandy, Edward Green, Gary Green, David Green, Morris Greenfield, Jimmy Grissom, Joseph Grachowski, John Grounds, Robert Gruba, Michael Guess, Stephen Golisarian, William Hacker, Alton Haynes, Ronald Haldes, Jerome Hall, Donald Hama, Charles Hanson, John Harmon, Thomas Harmon, Joseph Harris, Ronald Hebert, Charles Hungstealer, John Hepner, Alfred Hernandez, Wayne Hiller, Kenneth Hilligus, James Hollingsworth, Walter Honeycutt III, Lloyd Hood Jr., Richard Hopkins, Gerald Horton, Owen Hoskins, Ronald Housley, Dennis Huey, Otis Huggins, Robert Irwin, John Jack Jr., Dennis Jacobs, Donald Jacobs, Russell Jacobson Jr., Robert Jenkins, Jimmy Johnson, Charles Johnson, Larry Johnson, Charles Johnson, Frank Johnson, Jonathan Johnson, Richard Johnson Bjorg, George Johnson III, Robert Jones, Charles Joyce, Kenneth Kameyer,
Gerald Kandelek, Paul Kane, John Keefe, Kenneth Keekick, George Kessel Jr., Gary King, William King, Robert King, Dick Kursky, James Kosmalski, James Kraus, Robert Krofsick, George Lacey, Lyle Lacey, Thomas Lane, Horst Lang, Paul LaPierre, Peter Laux, Dale Lawrence, Eugene LeBon, Anthony Lee, Stephen Lembo, Robert Leon Guerrero, Walter Leuenberger, Joel Lindsay, Mark Lipman, Gary Lloyd, David Lopez, Robert Lyon, Richard McAdoo, Charles Mack, John Mack, David Maffia, Paul Malinowski, Dwight Maples, Harold Marsalis, John Martin II, Jesus Martinez Estrada, Danny Mather, Kenneth Matzus, Jack Mays, James McAllister, Danny McAtee, Michael McCarthy, Howard McCormick, Lonnie McDaniel, Arthur McFetridge, William McGraw, Joseph McGuan, Ronald McHale, David McKeon, Joseph McNair Sr., Albert McNeil Chambers, Roger Meeker, Teddy Melvin, Hubert Mercarrison Jr., Terrence Moronic, William Myers Zajewski, Roger Miller, James Miller, Paul Miller, Timothy Miller, Robert Miner, Edward Misiazik,
Robert Modelmog, William Montanati, Kenneth Morrison, Rodney Moses, Willard Murray, Theodore Ney, Richard Nelson, Robin Newhouse, James Neebs, Jack Niedermeyer, Marvin Nemeth, Robert Nix, John Knuckles, Donald Olson, Kenneth Ustenink, Benjamin Orozco, Robert Orta, Gilbert Ortega, Joseph Ostrowitzki, Turner Owens, Edward Pacilio, John Palmer, Jimmy Palmer, Vernon Park, Franklin Passantino, Dennis Patterson, Paul Paulette Jr., Clint Piegler, Ronald Peebles, Stephen Perlacki, Robert Parrott, Robert Petruska, William Phillips, James Pickett, Thomas Pianco, Wesley Place, Kenneth Porter, John Porth, Alfred Potter, Leonard Potter, Jerome Patak, Christian Post Jr., Edward Purdy, William Quinn, Paul Radian, George Raymond, Ronnie Reeves, Randolph Reese, Clifton Richard, Doyle Richardson, Lester Riley, William Ringersma, James Ringquest, Harrison Robinson, Donald Rose, Norbert Rosenbaum, Donald Rosalowski, Robert Rossman, Danny Rozier, Robert Ryan, Francis Sala, Philip Saldivar, Anthony Salvia, Robert Schaub,
David Shadd Sr., James Scheiblein, Gary Schuing, Richard Shilsky, Richard Schrank, Otto Schropp, Howard Schultz, Stanley Shaw, Lauren Shea, John Shepard, George Shields, Frederick Short, Rudolfo Schatz, Roy Seaford, Robert Sitek, Robert Seaver, Leo Seawick, Danny Skirvin, William Sliva, Edward Sly, Thomas Smith, James Smith, Larry Smith, Robert Smith, Vernon Smith, Philip Smith, John Smith, James Smoot, Glennon Summers, Dean Speakman, Donald Spiegel, Orrin Spencer, Joe Spencer Jr., William Squires, Michael Stanachek, Dale Staton, Harry Steele III, Bernard Stenzel, Jesse Stevens, Michael Stevens, Franklin Stewart, David Stewart Sr., Joseph Summit, Harley Sarit, James Swartz, Roderick Swigert, Stephen Tackwell, J. Tarbell Jr., Billy Tarver, John Terry, James Turway, Frederick Tomlin, John Trask, Richard Trufant, Paul Tuninga, Paul Urban, Michael Vanden Eind, William Van Arsdale, Esley Varvel, Robert Vaughn, Dennis Valenga, Ciro Viento, Frank Vole, John Wagner.
Kevin Walsh, Donald Walton, James Wark, James Washburn, Richard Watko, Frank Weinsheimer, Leslie Weisberg, Patrick Wells, Franklin Whaley, Raymond Whitby, Richard Whitney, David Wilkinson, Martin Willacker III, Richard Williams, Marvin Williams, Lester Wilson, Joseph Wilson, Larry Wine Sr., Johnny Winters, Kenneth Wiseman, Lee Whitman, Glenn Wojcik, Paul Woods, Robert Wright, Richard Zabukover, Bernard Zaleski, James Zimmerman, Henry Zippe, Owen Abel, Raphael Acosta, James Adkins Jr., John Angston, Alan Alberti, Robert Aldrich, Thomas Alls, J. Archibald, Ronald Ond, Donald Atkinson, Robert Badger, Stephen Barnes, Edward Barr, George Barry, Lawrence Bartow, Max Baston, Charles Bayliss, Gerald Bean, Michael Beaverson, Robert Belterman, Paul Bankston, John Barry, David B. Miller, Ralph Black, James Bletner, Denman Blissard, Dennis Bond, Howard Bonis Jr., Edwin Bowman, Howard Brent, Dennis Brower, Robert Brown,
Robert Brunn, Nathan Brusso Sr., Omar Buren, Mike Bowie, James Butte, Joseph Bird, Carl Caldwell, James Carpenter, Gary Carr, Arnaldo Carrasco, Kenneth Carter Jr., Clark Chamberlain, Lawrence Chartenitz, Greg Church, Charles Clatterbuck, John Clifford III, Eugene Cochran Jr., John Colgan, Irvin Collins, Michael Collins, Thurman Kahn, Danny Conrad, Robert Contreras Sr., Clifton Cornelius Jr., Gary Cranner, David Crook, Edward Crowley, James Kuelte, Curtis Culver, Philip Cummings, James Curry, Thomas Curry, Charles Dabney, Terry Dando, William Daniels, Ronald Davis, Michael Davis, Charles Davis, John Dawson Sr., Paul DeSillis, David DeCourt, Richard Delaney, Nicholas Denman, Nicholas DeFiore, Joseph DeGeneva, Justin Donnelly Sr., Gary Dowler, Michael Downey, Kerry Dudewick, Donald Duncan, William Duncan Jr., Norris Dunn, Herman Eagle Jr., Robert Ebersbach, Wayne Edows, Elbert Engeldow, Michael Erickson, David Eskew, James Estep, DeLon Fairburn, Peter Farrell, Ronald Fazio, Edward Feely,
Dennis Phelix Sr., Joseph Felke, William Fino, Thomas Fitzgerald, James Flint, Curtis Four, Clinton Foss Jr., David Foster, David Frank, Russell Freet, Delford Friedhoff, David Freyer, August Fuima Jr., Frank Gallardo, Gary Garcia, Ralph Garcia, John Garrettson, William Gianelli, Richard Giarusso, John Gilarowski, Douglas Gilliam, Thomas Gillis, Rafael Gonzalez, John Gossett Sr., Thomas Gray Sr., Melvin Green, Douglas Hammond Sr., James Hanley Sr., Michael Harris, John Haston, Edward Hayes, William Heath Jr., Frederick Hempel Jr., Harry Hensley, Henry Hernandez Jr., Florentino Herrera, Kenneth Hickey, Robert Hicks, Harold Higgs, John Hoff, Rush Holton, Michael Husak, Arthur Hotop, William Hughes, Wilmer Eisenhower, David Jacobus, Henry James Jr., Howard James Sr., Michael Jameson, Robert Jark, Maximo Jaso, Robert Jeffrey, William Jenkins, William Jenkins Jr., Edgar Jensen Jr., Dale Jepson, Alan Yerke, Chester June, Ernest Cower, Dennis Kelleher, Charles Kelton, Dennis Kennedy, Irvin Kessler, Louis Kiefer,
Michael King, Larry Kingsbury, Robert Kitchell, Roy Knight Jr., Roger Cahoot, John Koenig, Alan Kornblum, David Cordes Sr., Frank Kruger, Robert Puel, Billy Kulhavi, Ihor Kurnialka, Donald Kiner, Myron Lagomarsino, Frederick Lammer, Paul Lamasella, George Land, Donald Larson, Robert Lasko, Kenneth Lauritsen, Philip Lawing, Robert Leopold Sr., Benno Lurer, Russell Liebendorfer, Daniel Lindsay, Benedict Littlejohn, Lenny Livermore, John Lloyd Davies, William Lorusso, Paul McDonald, Daniel Mafredes, George Maltby, Francis Marion, Stephen Marquardt, Dennis Marsolis, Gerald Martick, Danny Martin, Ronald Maston, Robert Matuchik, Johnny McDonald, Peter McDougall, James McFarlane, David McGaughey, Lawrence McNichol, Robert Meester, Fred Meyer Jr., Larry Miles, Dale Miller, Addison Miller, Randall Miller, Paul Miller Jr., Joseph Moore, Ronald Moore, Jerry Moreland, Gregory Mullen, George Murphy, Michael Murphy, Dale Musoff, Richard Nataccioni, Donald Nemeth, William Norton, Larry Novak, Thomas O'Brien Jr., Jerome Ohlert,
David Omer, Arville Osborne, Stephen Owens, Bobby Pack Sr., Louis Palmerly, Bernard Parr, Richard Parsons III, Philip Patrick, Michael Pengele, Herbert Perrone, Clyde Peters, William Phillips, Michael Phillips, Gerald Pierce, William Pierce, Joseph Pamela, Andrew Potter, Arthur Pullen, Michael Pristia, John Price, Dale Prindle, Andrew Raskin, Charles Reed, Gerald Regal, Ralph Reinhardt III, Joseph Reynolds, Richard Rhodes, Thomas Rubottom, Stanley Riddle, Max Reitnor, Jr., Floyd Ritter, Ronald Roberts, James Rogers, Gerald Rogers, Edgar Rose, Thomas Rosebach, David Rowe, Mark Rozelle, Daniel Ruffing, Patsy Ruth, Roger Rutherford, William Sampy, Gary Sass, David Saucier, Lawrence Sauger, Joel Schulman, Alan Schultz, Harry Schumann, Frank Searles Jr., George Cedar, Byron Sheldon, Richard Siebert, Ronald Smith, Ellery Smith, Meredith Smith, Chester Smith Jr., Herbert Smith Sr., Emil Stass, Donald Stein, Thomas Stockwell, Michael Straw Sr., Paul Stewart, Alan Sturgis, Harold Sullivan,
Robert Sullivan, James Sutton, Clyde Sweeney, John Taft, William Tainter Jr., Terry Tart, Richard Taylor, John Taylor, William Tewalt, John Tenner, Howard Terrell, Escon Thompson, Rudine Thompson Sr., David Tortorich, Frank Arushia, McDonald Valentine Jr., Eugene Vanneman, Raymond Vanderbeek Jr., Roger Van Diver, Frank Wojtek, Kenneth Waite, Joseph Waitman, Jimmy Walker, Luther Wallace III, Billy Ward, Everett Warricks, William Waters, Sam Ware, James Webb, James Wines, William Werner, Dennis West, Leland West, Gary Wisner, David White, Ralph Whitman Sr., Paul Whitten, Bruce Williams, Albert Williams, Woodrow Wilson, Charles Wiseman Jr., Robert Witowski, Wayne Wolf, John Wolfe, Richard Wood, Larry Woodard, Ronald Woolery, John Wooten, Robert Worthley, Floyd Worthy, William Yarger Sr., Brent Young, Merrill Young, Leonard Zaleski, William Danchevsky Jr., Ronald Ziol, John Zadima,
Gary Abernathy, Alfonso Aguilar, James Albertson, Charles Alverson, Michael Anderson, Walter Anzac, Michael Apollonia, Mark Ardlian, Jerry Arnold, Denner Astick, Donald Atchley, David Babbitt, Richard Baez, Paul Bailey, Donnie Baker, Frank Balavage, John Ball, William Ballinger, Joseph Barthel, Edward Barton, Douglas Barton, Lawrence Bowman, Patrick Beard, Robert Beasley, Brian Becker, James Beherns, Gary Beisner, Michael Belay, Gary Benize, Curtis Berner, John Bertzinger, Danny Bishop, James Blackstock, Billy Blakely, Edwin Blyler, Stephen Borchert, Harry Boring, Gene Bowers, David Boyd, Dennis Brady, Gene Breeding, Robert Brinkley, Ronald Brome, David Brock, Alton Brock, John Brooks, Dennis Brooks, Ronald Brown, Calvin Brown, Robert Brown, Paul Brown, John Bruce, Joseph Bruno, Theodore Brusuelas, Thomas Buckingham, Thomas Bumgarner, Albert Bumstead, Earl Burton, Barry Cudrow, Francis Cadwallader, James Colicchio, Walter Cameron, Ronald Camp, Earl Canup,
Billy Carnell, Paul Carroll, Ronald Carroll, Harry Cass, Oscar Cavazos, Rocky Cheney, Lewis Chappell, Charles Chrisman, Joseph Chimney, John Clary, Paul Clement, James Clifford, Brian Cole, Robert Conley, Donald Connon, William Conroy, Stephen Cook, George Cook, Donald Cook, Calvin Crabtree, James Crago, Richard Cree, Merlin Crippen, Donald Crow, Robert Cup McKenna, Keith Curie, Lewis Curry, Thomas Dallas, George Davis, John Davis, Wayland Davis, Paul DeLuca, Anthony DeMito, Kenneth DePenning, James DeRico, Howard DeWeese, Ronald Dean, James Dean, Paul Deanovich, Dennis Decker, Terrence Decker, Russell Denman, Gary Denton, James Detch, James Dick, Donald Dodd, Hobart Dodson, Randall Doctor, Robert Dolan, Arnold Doty, Daniel Drummond, Robert Duncan, Bernard Dunn, Robert Dusa, Ernest Easterday, Edward Ebenhoe, Michael Edwardson, Barry English, Paul Ennis, Lawrence Eshelman, Arnold Estes, Terry Evans, Herman Fafard, Billy Fairchild,
Joseph Fanciullo, Larry Faulkner, James Fagley, John Fesser, Frank Fucht, Roy Fewell, Jack Fincher, James Fisher, Craig Ford, Jake Foster, Richard Franey, Lloyd Frankenberry, Jack Folsom, Robert Furlong, James Gaynor, Weldon Gainey, Robert Gaeta, John Gallant, Anthony Garcia, Ernesto Garcia, Dwayne Garner, Jackson Garrettson, Ralph Garrett, John Gieb, Thomas George, Patrick Gibbs, Paul Geese, Dennis Ginta, Richard Gould, Robert Golden, Richard Gonzalez, Jeffrey Gordon, Raymond Gozo, Michael Graff, Sanford Graham, Mark Graham, Frederick Gray, John Greenwood, Albert Grega, Leon Grenier, Frank Griffo, Armand Grew, Edward Gressing, James Gumble, Frank Gunther, Richard Gustafson, Mark Guy, Lawrence Hagin, Donald Higgins, Charles Hare, Donald Hall, Ronald Holleran, Leroy Hamilton, Harold Hammer, Jackie Hankins, James Hanson, Robert Hanson, Norman Hardy, Larry Harper, Ronald Harris, James Hassanor, Roger Hathaway, John Hattooney, Richard Hawkins,
Billy Haney, David Heffelbauer, Gerald Heidi, Walter Heller, Harold Helms, Gary Hendry, William Herring, Paul Herring, Charles Hess, Robert Hickman, James Higgin, William Hightower, Harold Hill, Dennis Hindman, Michael Hoagland, Jerry Holder, Gregory Hollinger, Ray Holloway, William Hooper, Richard Hotchkiss, James Howard, John Howlett, Ronald Hurwitz, Michael Aioli, Michael Yannick, Lawrence Jantz, Kirk Johnson, Larry Johnson, John Johnson, Theodore Johnson, John Johnston, John Jones, Donald Jones, William Jones, Donald Joyner, John Kaner, Joseph Keene, Walter Keating, Roderick Keene, Dennis Kelper, Bruce Kiefer, John King, Ronald Kingsley, Benjamin Kisner, Frederick Klein, Nicky Kleinfelter, Carl Nauer, Leonard Knotts.
Michael Coase, Robert Kofod, Joey Kuhn, Gerald Kowalski, Robert Krebs, Ralph Kolpa, Donald Consul, Howard Custer, Paul LaFontaine, Ronald Lamboy, James Landreth, James Lang, James Langford, Keith Lape, John Larkin, Dennis LaHoque,
Nicholas Latona, Elmer Lawrence, Daryl Lawrence, Michael Vios, Bruce Lewis, Jimmy Lindeman, Kurt Lasowski, Joseph Littersky, Thomas Loporto, Howard Lobato, Richard Lokar, Doyle Lombard, Gary Loncourage, Paul Lorenz, Charles Louviere, Walter Lunsford, Robert Lutz, Bobby Mabo, Gerald Madsen, Roger Mayor, Paul Mayu, Carl Malich, Terry Malone, Joe Marlowe, Stephen Martin, Cecil Matthews, Salvatore Mattina, Paul Mon, John MacArthur, Joseph McCartney, Patrick McClure, Charles McCullum, David McCormick, Jack McCullough, James McDaniel, Larry McDaniel, Harold McDonald, Gary McKinty, Edward McGrath, Paul McGrath, Bruce McLaughlin, Paul McMahon, Randy McNeese, Terry McFeeters, Barry McQuaid, Thomas McQuillan, Brian McTeague, George Medley, Roger Melser, Stephen Mendel, Willie Mercer, Bruce Meservey, Robert Michaelis, Joseph Michaud, William Middlebrooks, Stephen Mechnikovsky, Louis Miller, Michael Miller, Sidney Milligan, Donald Mitchell, Robert Mitchum, Clifford Mayashiro, Paul Moneymaker, David Moncales,
Robert Montano, Robert Montgomery, Stanley Moody, Lando Moore, Edward Moore, Jay Morgan, Alton Morris, Daniel Morrison, Richard Mueller, Marvin Muir, Marshall Mullins, George Munch, Chester Munzik, James Murphy, Hal Murphy, Richard Murphy, Billy Myatt, Gilbert Nauer, Michael Needham, Dennis Netko, Charles Newcomer, Ronald Niederkorn, Mark Neffenegger, Thomas Knock, Michael Noland, Harvey Norston, Daniel O'Grady, Earl Ostrike, David Ojibwe, Todd Orman, Edwin Osborne, Richard Osborne, James Osborne, Kenneth Osterbahn, Larry Otterbeck, James Otterness, Richard Overholzer, Freddie Owens, Kenneth Pacheco, Francisco Pedron, Cyril Paanui, Forrest Page, Tony Patterson, James Patton, Michael Patton, Craig Patswald, Harold Payne, William Peacock, Jerry Pegram, Terry Peterson, Donald Pfeiffer, Ronald Flugler, William Phillips, Edward Pitcher, Larry Pistole, Robert Plica, Carlos Polanco, Richard Punzel, Royce Purcell, Jimmy Pyle, Olin Queen, Gennaro Quinones, Roy Rascone, Robert Reagan.
Michael Reardon, Michael Revis, Wallace Reed, Billy Reeves, Richard Renier, Richard Reimer, James Rionis, David Retterstorff, Thomas Richards, William Richmond, Lauren Rickabow, Stephen Rittinger, Terry Reinhardt, Michael Rivard, Michael Robichaud, Raleigh Robinson, Robert Robson, Ramon Rodriguez Garcia, Donald Romer, James Roos, Robert Ross, Norman Rosendahl, Charles Russell, Joseph Ruthberg, Robert Salazar, Brian Saling, Robert Sangren, Warren Savignano, Thomas Scanlon, Bruce Shake, Max Scheider, Scott Schenk, Ronald Schmidt, John Schneider, Frank Schneider, Ronald Schnepp, John Schutty, Frank Schwab, Jerry Selby, Byron Selvage, Leonard Shields, Delbert Shores, John Shaw, Kenneth Shreves, Stephen Silliman, David Silva, Arthur Simard, Terry Simmons, Raymond Siriani, Roland Sisk, Alfred Scarr, James Slusser, Kenneth Slider, Raymond Smith, Leonard Smith, Harry Smith, Dallas Smith, Lafayette Smith, Robert Smith, Otis Snyder, Michael Sokola, Lloyd Southern, Dean Spence, Harold Sprague,
Gary Standard, Malcolm Stanford, Edward Stevens, William Studham, Robert Stevens, Robert Stittle, Stephen Stoddart, Ruley Stover, Ronald Strain, Randolph Straka, William Straight, Marvin Stubbs, Travis Sullivan, David Summer, George Surawi, Lyle Sustad, Ronald Swanson, Michael Swartwood, Tommy Tankersley, Thomas Taylor, Charles Taylor, James Terry, James Thomas, David Thomas, Billy Thomas, James Thompson, Darrell Thompson, Gary Toms, Herman Thornburg, Keith Tiffany, William Tigner, Robert Toland, Daniel Tomko, James Toscana, Clifford Treese, Albert Travail, Vincent Ungaro, Joe Ursoy, Edward Van Slyke, Clyde Van Winkle, Raymond Van Gorder, Gerard Vanderhoof, James Vesia, Lee Vickers, Carlos Villarreal, Benjamin Villegas, John Vitukas, William Wager, Ray Wagner, Wendell Walker, Donald Wank, John Ward, John Warren, James Warren, Francis Waters, William Weaver, Russell Weber, James Wells, Alvina West, Dale White, Stephen White, Engelbert Wyatrek, Frederick Whitticus,
Charles Wilkinson, Ronald Will, Rodney Wilson, Rodney Winchester, William Winter, Kim Winter, Lothrop Withington, Richard Whitwer, Pete Winnack, Richard Wobst, Donald Wallach, Walter Woltyan, Kenneth Wanacott, David Woodruff, James Woody, Robert Wooldridge,
Terry Wright, Larry Yoakum, James Yoshida, Ronald Zug, Albert Zuber, Vladislav Zervalek,
Arturo Acosta, John Adamick, James Adams, Ronald Adams, James Anderson, Richard Anthony, Robert Antone, Arnold Appleby, Bruce Arndt, Robert Arnold, Eddie Arnold, Gerard Ayoub, Stephen Auerbach, William Ayers, Thomas Bailey, Wayne Barker, Robert Barlow, Dwayne Barnard, Stephen Barnes, Thomas Barnhill, Robert Barr, Steve Barrett, Richard Bartlett, Donald Bartnick, Leo Battle, Clarence Bauman, Wallace Beck, Daniel Beese, Ronald Bean, Coy Bell, Francis Bell, William Bell,
Richard Benton, Bruce Berglund, David Bernruder, Raymond Beverly, John Blaylock, Denny Block, Richard Bohan, Jerry Bolin, Arnold Bonley, John Bonville, Roger Booth, Ronald Booth, Harlan Borens, David Bosquez, Howard Boswell, John Bort, Terry Brager, Michael Bragg, Clarence Branson, David Braze, Joseph Breslin, Robert Brzezowski, Thomas Bridges, Herbert Brooks, Eugene Brooks, Thomas Brown, William Brown, Richard Brown, Billy Brown, Marcus Bryant, Joseph Buckley, Ronald Bumbelow, Terry Burdett, Brian Burke, Don Burkhart, Peter Burrell, Ronald Burrows, Benjamin Busby, James Buttram, Jackie Cadell, Orrin Cadwell, James Keynes, Raymond Calafell, Donald Cannon, James Carmichael, James Carroll, Lucky Cartwright, Anthony Cassio, Gerald Castile, Michael Sestone, Cloyd Chaney, James Chaney, Daryl Chapman, Joseph Chapman, Carl Charette, William Childers, Francis Cheminsky, James Christensen, Frank Salino, Archie Clark, Richard Clark, Larry Cleaves, Terry Colby, Joe Collier,
Lawrence Conception, Brian Conley, Ansel Kahn, Francis Connors, Jim Contine, Thomas Conti, Robert Cook, Calvin Corley, Wayne Corliss, Jack Korn, Alan Coate, William Covington, Stanley Cox, Wendell Craig, Richard Crabessa, Michael Kraus, Ronald Crowley, William Cullen, Robert Curtin, Russell Curtis, John Diaxi, Walter De Silva, Robert Dahl, John Daly, Lawrence Darcy, Lloyd Darnell, Stephen David, Jimmy Davis, Melvin Davis, Gerald DeKoenig, Salvatore DeLuca, Daniel Delisle, Paul Dellinger, Paul Delmastro, Theodore Delto, Joseph Demps, Charles Detweiler, Robert DiBernardo, Terrence Dickinson, Thomas Diego, Herman Dillard, Ronald Dobbs, James Dolan, Joseph Delinsky, Michael Dooley, Thomas Doherty, Bernard Duzma, Richard Drennan, Frank Driscoll, Philip Driscoll, Patrick Dupuis, Adrian Durbin, Jack Dias, Norbert Dinsky, Frederick Eckley, Alan Edgeworth, Rufus Edwards, David Egressi, James Eggleston, William English, George Erickson, Fred Ernst, Paul Ertz, Wilma Evans.
Joseph Falabella, Harold Farrow, Michael Ferguson, Kenneth Philman, Stephen Fish, Ricky Fischel, Robert Fitzgerald, William Flatter, Philip Fletcher, Benjamin Flores, Joseph Fontana, Edgar Fauché, Dean Foster, James Franks, Jerry France, Lloyd Friel, Gary French, Richard Gomez, Harvey Gangler, Stephen Garcia, Frank Garcia, Alan Garis, Herbert Gensberger, James Genshock, James Gentry, Ernest Gilmore, Thomas Glenn, John Glenn, Richard Glennon, Charles Goins, Charles Gonder, Gregory Gonzalez, Alva Goss, David Gottwald, John Gottwald, William Gauker, David Googe, James Goff, Franklin Gould, David Granada, David Granger, James Grant, William Green, Thomas Green, John Grensinger, William Griggs, Nim Guffey, Rodney Gunch, Luis Gutierrez, Alton Gutschall, Robert Hackney, Gary Hackworth, Larry Hall, Thomas Hall, Lewis Hamblin, Terry Hamblin, Burl Hamby, William Hamilton, Mark Hannon, Malcolm Hardy, Robert Hardy, Claude Harlow, Claude Harper, Kenneth Harrelson,
Anthony Harris, Timothy Harris, David Harris, William Hart, Gordon Hartley, Wilbur Harvey, Robert Hassan, William Haynes, Arthur Healy, James Heath, Gerald Heitzenratter, James Helderman, John Helton, William Henning, James Herget, Bradley Hermanson, James Hill, Bruce Hilt, Martin Hirsch, Clifton Hobbs, Richard Hodges, George Hoffman, Edward Hokins, James Holbrook, Dennis Holland, Harold Holler, Francis Holowinski, Gary Homan, James Hood, Jimmy Howard, Otis Hudson, Daniel Hudson, Robert Hughes, Terry Hunter, Mark Hunter, Robert Hunter, Patrick Ingvoldstad, Donald James, Nicola Janet, Bruce Janoweski, Kenneth Yaros, James Jeffress, Robert Johnson, Tom Johnson, Dennis Johnson, Jerry Johnston, Steve Jones, Arthur Jones, Ralph Jordan, Robert Jukic, Kenneth Kennedy, James Carbon, Louis Keene, James Keener, Theodore Cattell, Gregory Kelly, James Kennemer, Robert Kepner, John Kilfeather, Ralph Killian, Thurman Kingsley, Sammy Kennett, John Klein, Daniel Klinger,
Raymond Knight, Gary Koch, Lee Kohler, Dennis Kolb, Robert Crable, John Latty, Wendell Lancaster, Jay Lang, Dennis LaValle, James Leach, John Lednam, R.V. Lee, Charles Leninger, John Lewis, Hobart Lilly, Paul Lindsay, Michael Livingston, William Locke, Robert Lord, Gary Lott, Raymond Lotz, James Lloyd, Robert Lutz, Richard Lutz, Dennis Lynch, Raymond Lyons, Gordon McPhee, Joseph Macchio, James McGuire, Anthony Manfroni, Gregory Marciello, Alfonso Marsh, David Martin, Earl Mason, Roderick Matheson, Harry Maury, Charles May, Peter Mayberry, Rodolfo Maines, Leonard McBride, William McCall, Patrick McCarthy, Patrick McDaniel, Buddy McDavid, Harris McLone, Charles McGuire, Alan McGuire, Michael McInerney, Philip McKimmey, Robert McKinley, Lawrence McLaughlin, William McManus, Hugh McNeil, Douglas McVeigh, Joseph McWaters, Forrest Meechan, Howard Mead, Darrell Meadows, Thomas Meal, Terrence Mellick, David Mendoza, George Mayer, Fred Michael, Lloyd Michaels,
Dennis Michalek, Thomas Mikulski, Francis Mill, James Miller, Michael Mishler, James Moon, John Moore, Stephen Moore, Michael Moore, Howard Moray, Francis Morin, Alan Morris, Harold Moreau, Douglas Moylan, Joseph Moulars, Bobby Mullins,
George Murphy, Charles Murray, Calvin Netherland, Richard Newell, Richard Newton, Ronald Nichols, Larry Knockmeyer, Elmer O'Brien, James O'Connell, Timothy Oshesky, Timothy O'Toole, Raymond O'Barr, Robert Oberlees, William Oberman, Roger Oakes, Charles Ort,
Stephen Ozier, Kenneth Ozyuk, Frank Pagano, Jerome Palomino, Elmo Patero, Bobby Payne, Edward Peacock, Bruce Pearson, Charles Pennington, Elias Peregrino, Stephen Peterson, Glenn Peterson, Jeffrey Petrowski, David Petzold, Wayne Faya, Richard Philippi,
Robert Pico, Royce Pierce, Robert Pivarotto, John Pohita, Lawrence Poirier, Alfonso Pompili, Roland Porter, Henry Porter, Richard Post, Terry Poster, Earl Powell, Bradley Prather, Larry Pulley, Michael Rochelle, Leonard Ramsey, Richard Rando,
James Rankin, Lindell Rawls, David Raynor, Michael Reddington, Peter Reedy, Raymond Reynolds, Michael Reynolds, Thomas Richards, Edwin Richter, Stephen Riddle, Ernest Riddle, Harold Wright, John Riggle, Harold Robertson, Hutch Robinson, Larry Robinson, Wilfredo Rodriguez, Joseph Rodriguez, Gabriel Rodriguez, Augustine Rodriguez, Arancel Rodriguez, George Rosa, Francis Rourke, Dale Roy, Stephen Rummock, David Rupp, Teddy Rushing, Orrin Rusk, John Russell, Thomas Rustman, Thomas Ruvelson, Edward Sailing, Jorge Sanchez, Paul Sandmeyer, Gerald Santee, Kenneth Satterfield, Lenwood Saunders, John Schiebelhut, Gary Schiappa, Daniel Schick, John Schmidt, Daniel Schmidt, Peter Schmidt, Thomas Schultz, Robert Schultz, John Schultz, Paul Schumacher, Stanley Skillion,
Alan Scott, John Seaman, Dennis Sears, Patrick Sheehan, Barry Shelton, John Shepard, Victor Short, Daryl Seibert, Jeff Silverman, James Simmons, Robert Simon, Johnny Simpson, Gary Simpson, Paul Slicker, George Sliwa, Robert Slover,
Paul Smith, William Smith, Harry Smith, William Smith, Michael Smith, Patrick Snay, Michael Snyder, Paul Sobka, Henry Sobolak, Larry Sparks, Bruce Spivey, Dale Spurlock, Terry Stanfield, George Stang, Roy Staples, Timothy Stein, Michael Stevens, Francis Stevens, Robert Stewart, Paul Stiles, Leland Stoddard, William Stokes, David Stone, Thomas Story, Norman Strasser, Richard Street, Hugh Stringer, Philip Stroman, Chalmer Strunk, Patrick Stuber, Stephen Summers, Patrick Serena, Robert Tallman, Richard Tarantino, William Tate, Donald Taylor, Robert Taylor, James Tebb, Thomas Temple, Timothy Tenney, Stephen Thaxton, William Thibodeau, Gregory Thom, Dennis Thompson, Leo Thorsness, Thomas Tinker, Michael Toland, Daniel Tomanica, Rodney Torrance, Oliver Townsell, William Tremonti, Richard Triscoe, Douglas Trump, Gary Tryon, Benjamin Tucker, John Tucker, Harry Tucker, James Tufts, William Turner, Maurice Uhlhorn, Michael Valerie, Richard Valpy, Ronald Vesey, Michael Verdi,
Anthony Villaggio, Philip Wade, Carl Wagner, Dennis Walker, Douglas Walkley, Donald Walsh, Lawrence Walsh, Paul Walukowitz, David Ward, Britt Watson, Daniel Weaver, James Wagoner, John Wheeler, Robert Whistler, Cletus Whitaker, Slatton White, Neil White, Eugene White, Joe White, William R. White III, Floyd Whitehead, Ralph Whitler, James Weigel, Robert Weiss, Earl Wiley, R.C. Williams, Brent Williams, David Williamson, Ronnie Wilson, Roger Wilson, Dale Wingate, James Wers, Roger Wood, James Wood, James Woodbury, Richard Woodbury, Michael Wolford, Fred Willard, James Wright, Jerry Wright, James Wynn, Randy Yarborough, Donald Yielding, Larry Zedick, William Zellman, Rodolfo Zertuch, James Zust.
Ernest Adkins, Joseph Alakness, Patrick Amell, Willie Anderson, Johnny Anderson, Peter Andrus, Malcolm Armstrong, Jack Arnold, John Ashley, Howard Atwater, Eusebio Avila, Adrian Badger, Larry Balls, Patrick Baker, John Balkin, Stuart Ballard, Walter Barber, Robert Barber, Harold Barefoot, Raymond Barnett, Bradley Barnett, Vincent Bavero, William Bell, Jack Bean, Patrick Beaver, Thomas Beck, John Beeler, Thomas Bierman, David Beggs, Carl Bielman, David Blaney, Harold Blankenship, George Bobb, Alan Bach, Brian Bukunovitz, James Bowles, Vincenzo Bordenaro, Larry Bowers, Darrell Bowman, Robert Box, Charles Bradfield, Roger Brown, Ronald Brown, Lester Brown, John Brown, Robert Bruno, Bernal Busing, John Belezza, Neil Burke, Charles Burkhart, Dennis Burmeister, Michael Burns, Floyd Burns, Herman Burris, David Burt, Henry Buss, Joseph Butler, Larry Byerly, Thomas Cafferty, Jesse Cantrell, William Carey, William Carlton, David Carman, Donald Chandler,
Dennis Christian, Stanley Sidlowski, Richard Clark, Leonard Clark, James Collette, William Collins, John Cook, David Cox, Carl Krabs, Ronald Krebs, Albert Crowder, Horace Crow, Donald Crow, John Culbertson, John Signarwitz, Bernard Zerwinski, Russell Dalton, Ray Darrow, Joseph Daugherty, James Davis, Richard Davis, Timothy Davis, Dennis Deems, Leonard Dinsmore, Larry Dobson, James Dollins, Joseph Dussault, Eddie Earls, Otis Edwards, George Edwards, Philip Eldon, Jamie Escabi, Patrick Farrell, Peter Fellman, Stanley Ferguson, Thomas Ferreira, Richard Fick, Robert Fiesler, Frank Filosa, John Finley, Terry Fix, Arthur Flanagan, Perry Flagnac, John Fleming, Jerry Floyd, John Flynn, Wayne Foster, Talma Fowler, Thomas Fraley, Obie Franklin, Donald Freeman, Richard Frost, Dominic Gabrielle, Joseph Gaffney, Barry Gallus, Mario Galvin, George Gonzars, Clarence Garcia, Brian Garman, Dwayne Garreau, Dennis Gasser, James Geiger, Anthony Genevrino,
Lowell Gilmore, Robert Glennon, Franklin Glow, William Goldman, Michael Goddess, Stan Gallus, Richard Greaser, Robert Griffiths, Paul Griggs, Larry Gross, John Gross, Frank Gubala, John Guilford, Alfred Guzlak, Joseph Hatch, Kenneth Hadley, Stephen Haish, Legree Hairston, Floyd Hall, Ross Hall, Willie Hall, Alan Hancock, Robert Hanuschik, John Hardin, Frank Harrison, Keith Hirsch, Stephen Hellerstein, Edward Hennessy, Raymond Hesters, William Hewitt, Chester Hibbert, Rodney Higgins, Samuel Hines, Donald Hirsch, Loren Hodge, David Hofditz, Philip Holdaway, Robert Hope, Gerald Hunn, Frederick Hummel, Peter Hundall, William Honeycutt, William Hunt, David Hutchinson, Mark Hutchinson, Daniel Ingalls, Bruce Jenkins, Richard Johnson, Edward Johnson, Tommy Jones, Samuel Jones, John Callis, Ricky Carles, Joseph Casper, Thomas Kelly, James Kelly, James Kesselring, Delbert Kibler, Danny Kinsley, Yaroslav Klimek, Jeffrey Knutson, Brian Colby, Jack Coleman, Lawrence Kuhn,
David Coons, Ronald Lanhart, James Langford, Lawrence Larson, William Larson, Richard Lau, Lee Ledet, Paul Lee, Kyle Letterman, Cecil Lewis, Jerry Linhart, Wallace Littlewood, Frank Machovsky, Porfirio Macias, Vincent Macy, Alfred Magrum, Patrick Malone, Howard Malone, James Maloney, David Mason, Teddy Matney, Jeffrey McCrae, Robert McDuffie, James McGarity, Frank McGlinchey, Sylvester McLaughlin, Jimmy McGraw, John Meacham, Norman Megahan, William Meineke, Paul Melnick, Paul Minsinkus, James Menzef, William Merritt, Stanley Mersand, Barry Miller, Wiley Mingia, John Miskimmins, Roland Mitchell, Larry Mitchell, Samuel Molsky, Patrick Monahan, Salvador Montoya, Dale Morin, Sanford Mullis, Victor Nacianceno, Michael Nigerian, Michael Nash, M.C. Nelson, Norman Ness, Jerry O'Neill, Michael O'Toole, William Oldham, Donald Olds, Gary Oltz, John Owings, Daniel Panic, Joseph Pavlik, Carol Peterson, David Penzinski, W.C. Pepper, Alan Peterson, Dale Peterson, Craig Phillips,
John Pierce, Michael Pikula, James Penter, Henry Podlazewski, Gordon Pollitt, Salvatore Popolo, Richard Porrata, Gordon Porterfield, Marvin Poser, Dwight Powers, Benjamin Primus, Stephen Prince, Florencio Ramirez, Robert Rands, Harley Rayburn, Richard Reed, David Reese, Robert Reeves, Ricardo Reyes, William Reynolds, James Richcreek, John Risco, Richard Rivera, John Robinson, Michael Rogers, James Rose, Ricardo Sanchez, John Sandow, Edward Santiago, Craig Sawmiller, Leo Schaefer, Lance Schultes, Michael Schrock, Billy Seagraves, Charles Shirkady, Michael Sharp, James Shawlin, John Sims, Glenn Smith, Daniel Stachersky, Paul Stoudenmeyer, David Stencil, Charles Stephan, Ross Stephen, Lawrence Steins, Alan Sterling, Donald Street, Elmer Strickland, Alan Strout, Dexter Sturgeon, Howard Stutz, Nestle Sutton, Fred Savarni, David Swarthout, Joseph Tallarico, Wayne Talley, Earl Taylor, Frederick Temple, Arthur Thomas, Edward Thompson, Terry Tiffany, Robert Toman, Corsino Toro, Louis Totten,
Donald Tucker, Robert Toolwitz, Carlos Oresti, John Valente, Glenn Valeroso, Jose Velez Murillo, Glenn Vermette, Richard Vigas, Stephen Vineyard, Michael Voigt, William Ward, Richard Watson, David Weltick, Koval Wetmore, Dale Wicker, Jeremiah Whittier, Herbert Wilkes, John Williams, Kevin Williams, Robert Williams, Ronald Williams, John Williams, Terry Wilson, Donald Wilson, Wayne Wines, Charles Wing, William Wisniewski, Stephen Weistrand, James Wood, Raymond Wood, Richard Woodcock, Paul Woods, Morris Wright, Ronald Winigar, James Wynn, Donald Yates, Howard Yateman, Robert Young, John Young, Dennis Zagarzinski, George Zimmer,
Jonathan Adams, Stanley Adkins, Walter Adkins, Amos Aldrich, Richard Alfieri, Charles Alsheimer, Gilbert Alvarez, Armando Ansira, Perry Anderson, Jimmy Anderson, Richard Anderson, Kenneth Anderson, William Anderson, Manuel Argyris, Arthur Arias, Joseph Armstrong, Gary Armstrong, Barry Arand, James Arnold, Roy Arwood, Michael Ash, Frederick Ash, Michael Ayers, Charles Bailey, Jerry Baker, Lawrence Baldwin, William Barriger, Ronald Barnett, Dean Bartling, Daniel Bates, Douglas Bauer, Joseph Bauer, Albert Becker, Dennis Beckler, Wayne Berkwest, Michael Burms, Thomas Besch, Donald Bilski, Terrence Bishop, William Black, Roger Blair, Robert Bogard, Thomas Boland, Richard Bone, Bruce Bosenbecker, James Bowling, William Bradner, Larry Brando, Robert Bransfield, Edward Bristol, David Brodsky, Richard Brom, Richard Brown, Joseph Brown, James Brown, Darwin Brownlee, Richard Bruce, Thomas Brule, James Bruley, David Bulla, James Berg, Charles Burns, Jerry Burr, Robert Burt,
Gary Bazell, Elisha Bird, Cecil Cahala, Jack Caldwell, David Campbell, James Carl, James Carlisle, George Carson, Greg Carson, William Carter, Charles Carver, Charles Case, Terry Cottle, Peter Cavatayo, Richard Sikoric, Roland Chalfant, Paul Chambers, William Chambers, John Cherovich, David Claspel, Gary Clemon, Raymond Coleman, Willie Coleman, Emilio Colon, Jerry Caldwell, Everett Comfort, George Connell, Dale Connors, Brian Connolly, Raul Contreras, John Conway, Larry Cornelius, Marion Cox, Edward Coyne, Bert Kratzley, Wallace Crawford, Vaughn Creighton, Charles Cressens, David Cripps, Blaine Crowfoot, Roger Cuff, James Cummings, Charles Daniels, Lynn Davis, Norman Davis, Eulin Davis, George Dawson, Arthur Dayton, Miguel de la O, John DeMarco, Lester Deek, Robert Dearborn, Donald Delandro, Daniel Devich, John DeStefano, Alex Diaz, John Dibble, Daniel Diridoni, Thomas Dowler, John Dowling, William Dudley, Leon Dunhurst, Barry Dussault, George Dye,
Terry Etherton, Harold Eaton, Gordon Elkins, John Elstad, David Ellis, Charles Erickson, David Evans, Curtis Fagard, Edward Than, Thomas Foucher, Donald Fechner, Robert Fecken, Frank Ferret, William Ferguson, Edward Fernandez, James Ferris, Ross Flanagan, David Ford, David Foster, James Foster, Lawrence Fournier, Joseph Fox, Kent Freeman, Otis Freeman, Jeffrey Friedfeld, Dean Frost, George Gambrell, Johnny Garcia, Edward Godet, Arlen George, John Giampia, Thomas Gibbs, Maurice Gibson, Charles Gilmore, Tim Gilmore, Clifton Goins, James Goins, Demisio Gonzalez, John Goodfellow, Richard Goulet, Fred Griego, Thomas Griffin, James Guest, Alfred Gutierrez, Larry Hallett, Oscar Hampel, Howard Hanold, Paul Harbold, David Harrell, Larry Harris, Paul Hart, Donald Hart, Lester Hartman, Michael Harvey, Robert Hayes, Charles Haywood, Dennis Hagee, Gordon Heathcote, James Hebert, Rory Hegger, Robert Heinen, Michael Hemker, Philip Hinkey, Thomas Harity,
Joseph Herbert, Charles Herman, Billy Hill, Donald Hill, Fred Hillman, James Hills, Chalmers Hennant, John Hipple, Lester Hodges, Richard Hollis, Glenn Holtman, Leroy Housel, Joseph Hoyka, Donald Hubert, Raymond Hughes, Darrell Holbert, Donald Hume, Peter Hunt, Robert Hunter, James Herney, James Hutchison, Fidel Ingracia, William Jackson, Dale Jackson, Alan Yankee, Daniel Jacob, Robert Jarvie, Stanley Jarvis, Terry J. John, John Jersey, Charles Jokel, Roger Johnson, John Johnston, Daniel Johnstone, Henry Jolly, Douglas Jorgensen, Gerald Jurgensen, Dennis Kane, Michael Kane, Joseph Catalyst, Richard Kudrowski, James Keach, Rodney Kiefer, Ronald Keister, Richard Kelly, Johnny Kendrick, Raymond Ketz, Charles Key, John Kidney, Willis Kiltho, Philip Kirkland, John Cottrell, Keith Klaus, Robert Knight, Richard Koch, John Koch, William Kovacic, Frankie Kowalski, Richard Kroger, Richard Kuhn, Lawrence Kulik, William Kundo, Joseph Kuznets, Charles Leclerc,
John Laffey, Charles Lair, Leon Lambeth, Gordon Lane, Billy Lane, William Lane, Norman LeBrun, Daniel Leapart, Ray Lee, James Lee, Thomas Lurzak, Robert Letchworth, Edwin Lewis, Patrick Lindsay, Herminio Linceo, John Licori, George Long, Sterling Longfellow, Jerry Looney, Raymond Lopez, Arthur Lucero, Thomas Lynch, William Lyons, Richard McEnroth, Johnny Mallory, Jerry Manetta, Constantine Manos, Freeman Marcy, Donald Marefka, Cesar Martinez, Craig Matthews, Roland Matthews, Wilfred McLeod, Daniel McCormick, James McCracken, Richard McCready, James McDonald, Eugene McElhaney, David McAvoy, Nathan McGee, Paul McKee, Donald McKnight, David Melvin, Dennis Merrill, Russell Messick, Peter McCallie, Joseph McCod, Richard McNacka, Richard Milford, Dale Miller, George Miller, John Miller, James Monahan, Robert Monroe, Thomas Moore, James Moore, James Moore, Raymond Morris, Clyde Morton, Frederick Muella, James Mulhern, George Mullen, Richard Murphy, Douglas Murphy,
Robert Murphy, Kevin Murray, Bradley Ney, Peter Nellison, James Nealis, Daniel Nelson, Charles Nelson, John Nelson, Kevin O'Callahan, John O'Keefe, Todd Oakes, William Oberg, George Olin, Malcolm Ott, Dennis Ott, Clifford Owens, Joseph Pasella, Ronald Pajolzik, Joseph Padilla, Roy Palmer, Michael Pardue, James Paris, Jack Park, Benjamin Parker, George Peckham, Tommy Peterson, Donald Pelkey, Donald Panzera, Charles Pernicaro, Larry Perry, Dennis Peterson, Ralph Pettit, Robert Pfeiffer, James Pierce, Travis Pilcher, Arthur Pilkington, John Pittenger, Harlan Pollock, Harold Porter, Colin Powell, Douglas Powell, Mark Prather, Richard Prisler, Garland Proctor, Roy Pullins, Richard Quinn, Matthew Rabel, Eugene Ram, Jose Ramos, Louis Rayner, James Reeder, Thomas Richard, Raymond Riley, Thomas Riley, James Rioux, Billy Risner, Thomas Rivera, George Roberts, Randall Roberts, John Roberts, Raymond Rodabow, Thomas Rodland, Don Rogers, Ronald Rowland.
James Rowland, Robert Rolfe, John Ronayne, Carlton Rose, Terry Rose, John Rubel, Ronald Rumford, Arnold Russell, John Ryan, Joseph Ryan, Daniel Sandstrom, George Sargent, Donald Shate, Dennis Schildmeyer, Marvin Schlichting, Thomas Schmid, Dennis Schnothorst, Richard Scholler, Donald Schultes, Kenneth Schorsch, Dale Schroth, Floyd Serbanjak, Willie Sessoms, Ralph Shirey, Ernest Simus, Leo Simmons, Ronald Scorts, Michael Smethers, Harry Smith, William Smith, Lonnie Smith, Harvey Smith, Alan Smith, Charles Smith, Stephen Sokolowski, Richard Susi, Edward Specht, Donald Spencer, James Spruill, Paul Stancliffe, William Staunton, Merle Steinman, John Stevens, Randall Stevens, Jimmy Stitt, Darrell Stoltenberg, Michael Story, Edward Sullivan, Darrell Somerton, James Sumner, Clark Sutphin, James Swan, Tony Swartz, James Sweetman, Theodore Swenson, Warren Swinford, Cecil Seifert, Andrew Sipus, Terence Szymanski, James Szymanski, Mallard Tackett, Gary Tanner, Gary Talton, James Taylor,
Reuben Taylor, Lacey Thomas, Dennis Thomas, Frederick Thompson, Tommy Thompson, R.J. Thompson, Gary Thornton, George Tillman, Roger Tolbert, John Tuchett, James Tracy, Sylvester Ull, Jerry Underwood, Isidore Unger, James Utzig, Cyril Van Mark, Edwin Vega, Guadalupe Velazquez, Manuel Velez, Chester Villa, Myron Wagner, Anthony Wallace, James Walsh, David Ward, Joseph Ward, Dennis Warner, Keith Warren, Tom Wasmer, James Wasser, Keith Watkins, Russell Weaver, Rodney Weeks, Robert Wheel, Noah Weinberger, Charles Welch, Wayne Weldon, Robert Winnig, John Westbrook, Danny White, Thomas White, John White, Philip Wycheck, Felix Williams, Ben Williams, Michael Wilson, Stephen Wilson, Ray Wilson, Lester Wilson, Kenneth Wilternick, Philip Woodman, George Work, James Workman, Ronnie Worley, Philip Worley, Jesse Worthington, James Wright, Glenn Wright, George Youngblood, Joseph Zakraszewski, Stephen Zalewski, John Zudnowski, Gerald Zeckmeister, Charles Zimmerman, Clifford Zerbes, George Zuvela,
Jeffrey Abbott, Anthony Abrams, Ralph Abston, Clifford Adams, Darrell Adams, Sammy Adams, Roger Arends, Charles L. Britton, Gary Aldrich, Basil Alexander, Jack Anderson, Florentine Angel, Charles Arthur, Joseph Ascolillo, Kenneth Ashby, Willie Ashley, Ronald Asselin, Gary Atchison, Ray O'Quan, Enrique Baldonado, Paul Bannock, David Banashevsky, Richard Barriga, Albert Baranayak, Donald Barger, Gary Barker, Timothy Bartram, Stephen Bartram, Leonard Baxter, David Beale, James Beasley, Robert Beck, John Beck, Dennis B., William Benedict, Clifford Bennett, William Bennett, Virgil Bennett, Edward Benson, Daniel Bethel, Roy Betteridge, Alan Betts, Bruce Bezio, John Bixacki, Philip Bingaman, Ulysses Black, Michael Blackburn, William Blankenship.
Jerry Blanton, Roger Blaylock, Clarence Bond, Ted Bockwist, William Borman, Dewey Boswell, Mark Boutwell, Bobby Brannon, Timothy Brott, William Breedlove, Larry Bryce, Marvin Breetsk, Carl Briggs,
Lovis Brinkley,
Walter Brock, Milton Broadhead, Carl Brooks, David Bratt, James Brown, James Brown, Michael Bruckler, Richard Bruning, William Bruno, Thomas Bryant, Christopher Bubness, James Bumgartner, Robert Busby, John Buchak, Gary Butler, Michael Caldwell, Dean Callison, Brian Campbell, James Canfield, Calvin Carlson, Harlan Carlson, Clarence Carpenter, James Carroll, Lawrence Carter, William Cartier, Donald Cates, Raymond Cawley, Herbert Chambers, Robert Champagne, Stephen Champeau, Patrick Childers, James Cratian, Ronald Christensen, John Clark,
Robert Clinton, Paul Close, David Cole, Richard Coleman, Donald Comfort, Merlin Cook, Robert Copeland, Thomas Corey, Gerald Costa, Michael Cotter, Thomas Cohen, Thomas Cribbs, Stephen Crumbling, James Culhane, Jack Danielson, Richard Darr, Michael Davia, Roger Davinian, Robert Davis, Louis Davis, Earl Davis, Ronald Day, Anthony DeFina, George DeVries, Kenneth Debert, Gregory DeBrocke, John Delaney, Ronald Delia, James Delp, Lawrence Derkach, John Deschamps, Michael Desmarais, Ronald Dewing, Stephen DeGangi, Gary Dino, Donald Dixon, Terry Domek, Gerald Doyle, Alfred Duby, Jack Dunn, John Dunn, Gary Dwyer, Kenneth Etherly, Ronald Effler, Wayne Eller, John Elliott, Dennis Engebretson, Jonathan Engelhard,
James Irwin, Rafael Espada, Richard Falardo, Keith Fay, Michael Felice, Denton Fenstermacher, Samuel Ferguson, John Fye, Robert Fika, Bernard Fiscus, Jonathan Fisher, David Fitzgerald, Arthur Flynn, George Fogel, Peter Foltz, William Fornash, Lawrence Fredericks, William Freeman, Robert Fry, Richard Fuentes, Ronald Gazinski, William Gallagher, Joseph Gallegos, Dennis Galvin, Timothy Gard, Gerald Garrison, Gilbert Gelling, Darrell Giroux, James Gillenwater, Creedon Gitt, James Glasgow, Jimmy Goins, Ernesto Gonzalez, Edward Graffier, Kenneth Grant, Don Gray, Gregory Gray, Walter Green, Robert Green, John Hadfield, Dennis Hadler, Richard Hafer, John Hagan, Earl Haynes, J. Halliday, Jerry Hamilton, Joseph Harbinson, Spencer Harding,
James Hart, William Hartley, William Hazelton, Thomas Hathaway, James Hatter, James Haig, Raymond Hazard, Michael Heater, Lloyd Heath, Rodney Heckerman, Philip Heil, Kevin Helferich, James Hendershot, Eugene Henderson, James Hinkey, Raymond Henry, Frank Hensley, Doyle Hensley, James Herder, Robert Highlands, Gary Hines, Robert Heitzman, Larry Lavka, Dennis Hockenberry, Donald Hogan, Elvin Holliday, Gene Hollingsworth, Edwin Holtzworth, Roger Hausner, John Hunter, Lee Hunter, Gary Houston, Roger Highland, Joseph Ingino, Michael Ingram, Thomas Jagger, George James, Russell Jameson, Louis Giampetro, Anthony Jacinconis, David Jenkins, Frederick Jenneman, Douglas Jensen, Robert Johnson, Otto Johnson, Joe Johnson, William Johnson, Kenneth Johnson,
Curtis Johnson, Rodney Johnston, Douglas Johnston, Paul Joines, James Jones, Ronald Jones, George Cardis, Andrew Casper, Ricky Kaufman, Samson Kiana, Thomas Kearney, David Keller, Robert Kelly, David Kenny, Robert Kirscher, Charles Kaiser, Dennis Kilday, John Kimmel, Donald King, Robert Kipp, Gary Klopstein, David Noth, Joseph Knipes, Joseph Knowles, William Kohler, Joseph Kopek, Kenneth Colin, Donald Kowalik, Jerome Kramer, Rory Kraft, Richard Kramer, Kenneth Krimmel, Stuart Crumpets, James Kruger, Donald Kinsey, Michael Kulig, Joseph Kurth, Charles Laforty, Donald Lambert, Richard Landerman, Frank Lanish, Anthony Lapadura, George Lawhorn, Bobby Lee, Raymond Lee, Walter Lee, David Lycum, Thomas Lewis,
Richard Libby, Kenneth Lish, Donald Litzow, Mario Losapio, Martine Lopez, Richard Lorbetsky, Thomas Larenk, Stephen Love, Everett Lowry, Michael Lyon, John Mackin, Jeff Maddox, Robert Maddich, Ralph Mailer, Charles Maglione, Ronnie Mahan, Joseph Marshy, Robert Merrill, Merle McCard, Samuel Marquez, Robert Marshall, Dwayne Martin, Gary Martin, Christopher Martinson, Orlando Mattis Sosa, Gary Matrow, John Mayberry, Justin McCarthy, Michael McClendon, Phil McClendon, Anthony McCloskey, Keith McCullum, Dennis McFarland, Colin McIntosh, Gary McMurtry, Lyle Minky, Charles Meyer, Dana Miller, Jerry Miller, Paul Millwood, Kenneth Mincher, Curtis Mincher, Dean Mitchell, Bobby Mitchell, Donald Moberg, Robert Molenkoff, Paul Montgomery, Dennis Moore.
Billy Moore, Thomas Moreland, Mario Moreno, Charles Morris, Richard Morrison, Joseph Morrison, Lowell Mortimer, Melvin Moulton, Charles Munch, Michael Murphy, Danny Murphy, Dennis Murphy, Leroy Nash, John Nafel, Andrew Noggle, Gary Nelson, Robert Nelson, Stephen Neuendorf, Larry Neville, David Newell, Sanford Newman, Edgar Newsom, Patrick Nex, Larry Nicholson, Thomas Nicodemus, John Nitka, William Knoll, Joseph Noonan, Ian Nolte, David Nummer, Patrick O'Brien, Brian O'Connor, Donald Oakley, David Oldbear,
Johnny Olison,
David Olson, Theodore Orahood, Kenneth Osborne, Barry Ossel, Anthony Oswald, Clement Palladino, Robert Palmer, Michael Paris, Eldon Passard, Louis Patty, Francis Patours, Ernest Paw, Frank Peacock,
Roger Pearson, George P., Michael Peterson, Robert Perez, Frederick Piskorski, Ronald Paff, Stanley Phillips, Carl Phillips, Wendell Phillips, Frank Pietropolo, Paul Poling, Ernst Pohl, Marvin Potts, Jerry Powell, Harold Price, Michiel Prochaska, Ronald Prosser, Louis Puckett, Robert Pilert, Richard Quick, John Quilty, John Quinlan, Joseph Quinn, Michael Raby, James Rains, Walden Rains, Anthony Rector, Carl Reeves, Edward Rimmers, Lawrence Rapanchik, Keith Retzlaff, Larry Revlett, Anthony Richards, Charles Richardson, Dennis Richland, Delfino Rios, Donald Richer, Alan Robb, Freddie Robertson, Larry Robinson, Elkanah Robinson, Albert Robinson, Ronald Rowe, Ricky Rogers, Charles Rollins, Roger Romick, Charles Rummel, John Rush,
Henry Rutledge, Gary Sage, Kelly Sage, Gregory Sage, Melanio Salinas, Daniel Saltz, James Sanders, Ronald Sandoval, Ronald Seville, David Schaaf, Richard Schofield, Richard Shrunk, Alvin Schultz, Rudy Scott, Robert Scott, Joe Sagari, Brian Severson, James Shaleen, David Shea, John Shepherdson, Alva Sheridan, Carl Scherer, Ronnie Schewel, Anthony Schumacheris, Patrick Sigmund, Alan Simpson, Gail Sipes, Larry Sizemore, Dexter Slater, Michael Smith, Nathan Smith, Stanley Smith, Daniel Smith, Michael Smith, William Smolik, Robert Sneeden, Daryl Snedarich, Robert Snyder, Henry Sotert, Larry Spencer, Terry Staberg, Thomas Stello, Roger Stevenson, Michael Stevenson, Ralph Stone, John Stoll, William Straub, Robert Strahan,
Jerome Stricker, James Stringham, Donald Sullivan, Victor Serber, Keith Serber, Dwayne Swanson, Dennis Swecker, Jamie Tate, Wade Tassar, Robert Thoreau, Leon Thigpen, Philip Thomas, James Thomas, David Thompson, Perry Thon, Michael Thornton, Dennis Tidquist, Dennis Toby, Henry Totticini, Ronaldo Torres, Arthur Toscano, Albert Townsend, Randy Travis, Lawrence Travis, Raymond Trumpke, Floyd Turek, Randy Turner, Charles Turner, Mark Turner, Willie Tyner, Peter Van Cook, Dwight Van Inwagen, Rodney Van Queckelberg, Troy Barney, Boyd Badalaro, Timothy Binsky, James Bailard, Pablo Villarreal, Kenneth Voigt, Stanley Voigt, John Vollmer, James Vrabel, John Wachter, Robert Wade, Richard Wallier, Dan Walker, Doyle Warbler, Douglas Ward,
Gerald Ward, Mitchell Ward, Cyrus Warner, Marlon Waterbury, David Watson, Roger Watlet, Jean Warziniak, Frank Wayman, James Weaver, Thomas Weaver, Gerald Weinstein, Daniel Welch, William Welker, Michael Werger, Lori West, Gary Westrick, Robert Wheeler, Joel Whiteley, Larry Witt, Donovan Wickstrom, Darrell Wilkes, Richard Will, Johnny Williams, Larry Wilmsen, Wayne Windholsh, George Wing, David Winger, James Winslow, Michael Wise, James Vlodarczyk, Alan Wondergem, Paul Woods, Douglas Wright, Dean Wright, William Young, Edward Zielinski, Charles Zirion, Frank Zustiak.
VVMF's In Memory program honors those who served in Vietnam, returned home, and later died. A ceremony is held each year on the site of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. to induct new veterans into the In Memory Honor Roll. To learn more or to nominate your Vietnam veteran to be honored for their service and sacrifice, please visit our website.